At my wife's funeral, I stood shivering in the rain while her secret family shoved legal papers against my chest and demanded I sign over everything. I signed them through tears because I thought my life was already over. I had no idea that when their high-priced lawyer reached page 5 of that document, every single one of their names would appear right next to the word federal indictment. But to understand how a modest city archivist brought down a criminal empire, you have to understand the moment my entire reality fractured. The rain was pouring down on the cemetery in heavy freezing sheets. I was 36 years old and burying the only woman I had ever loved. I wore a cheap off-the-rack suit that I had bought 5 years ago for a friend's wedding. It was soaked through, entirely clinging to my shoulders, making me feel even smaller than I already did. My hands were completely numb. I stared down at the polished wood of Clara's casket, trying to comprehend that she was actually inside it. Just 4 days ago, we were eating leftover pasta on our worn-out couch. Now, she was gone. But the crushing grief in my chest was slowly being pushed aside by a growing, sickening sense of confusion. I looked away from the grave and scanned the crowd. None of this made any sense. Clara was an accountant. For the 8 years we were married, she told me she worked for a boring mid-level property management firm. We lived in a standard 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. We drove older cars. We budgeted for our groceries. We skipped vacations to pay down our mortgage. I am a municipal archivist for the city. I spend my days categorizing historical records, zoning permits, and tax plots. It is honest, quiet work, and it pays a modest city salary. Clara always told me she loved how steady and reliable I was. She told me our simple life was all she ever wanted. So why was her funeral surrounded by a fleet of blacked-out Range Rovers and Mercedes SUVs? There were at least 40 people standing around the gravesite who I had never seen before in my life. These were not middle-class accountants. These were men in bespoke Italian wool suits holding massive custom umbrellas. These were women wearing designer sunglasses and $1,000 trench coats despite the pouring rain. They stood in tight little clusters, completely ignoring the priest. They were not crying. They were not mourning. They were working. I strained my ears over the sound of the rain hitting the umbrellas. I could hear their whispers cutting through the cold air. We need to secure the LLCs before probate. Did he sign the relinquishment yet? If the accounts freeze, we lose the leverage. I blinked the rain out of my eyes, trying to process the words. LLCs. Probate. Frozen accounts. Who were these people? Why were they talking about my wife like she was a corporate asset that needed to be liquidated? I looked across the open grave, seeking some kind of anchor, some familiar face to help me understand. Instead, I found my brother-in-law Bradley and my mother-in-law Susan. If I felt out of place at my own wife's funeral, they looked like they owned the cemetery. Bradley was a real estate developer. Or at least that is what Clara always told me. He was 4 years older than me and carried himself with the kind of aggressive arrogance that only comes from inherited wealth and zero consequences. He was wearing a custom Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my car. The rain seemed to bounce right off his silk umbrella. He was checking his solid gold Rolex every 2 minutes, shifting his weight impatiently. He did not look at the casket once. Next to him stood Susan. She was draped from head to toe in designer black. Her posture was rigid, her expression completely stony. In the 8 years I was married to her daughter, Susan had spoken to me maybe 10 times. She always made it incredibly clear that I was a massive disappointment. She viewed my job as an archivist, as a hobby for weak men. She believed Clara had married drastically beneath her station. Today, she did not offer me a single word of comfort. She just stared at me from across the grave with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The priest was reading a psalm. His voice was a low hum, trying to bring peace to a moment that suddenly felt entirely hostile. I wanted to tell everyone to leave. I wanted to scream at the men in the Italian suits to stop whispering. I wanted to fall to my knees and beg Clara to wake up and explain what was happening. A man stepped up beside Bradley. He was tall, wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He leaned in and whispered something into Bradley's ear. Bradley nodded, his jaw tightening. He looked directly at me. There was no sympathy in his eyes. There was only a cold, calculated urgency. The priest raised his hand to deliver the final commendation. Before the words "ashes to ashes" could even leave his mouth, Bradley stepped forward. He did not wait for the prayer to end. He did not wait for the casket to be lowered. He walked right over the artificial green grass covering the mud, ignoring the priest completely. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. I thought for a brief second that he was coming to embrace me, that maybe the reality of losing his sister had finally hit him, and he needed the comfort of the only other man who loved her. I was so incredibly wrong. Bradley stopped inches from my face. He did not offer a handshake. He did not offer a hug. Instead, he reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He shoved it hard against my chest. I reflexively brought my hands up to catch it. The envelope was heavy. It felt like a brick of paper. "Sign it," Bradley said. His voice was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut right through the sound of the rain. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at his face. My mind was completely blank. "What is this?" Susan stepped up behind him. She did not bother to lower her voice. She spoke loudly enough for the strangers in the suits to hear. "Stop playing dumb, Thomas. We do not have time for your pathetic little act today." I took a step back, clutching the envelope. The paper was already getting wet from the rain. "Susan, what are you talking about?" "We are burying Clara. The priest is not even finished." Bradley stepped closer, backing me toward the edge of the mud. The priest had stopped talking. The entire cemetery had gone dead silent. All 40 strangers were now watching me. "Clara is gone," Bradley said, his tone dripping with absolute venom. "She carried you for 8 years. You are a librarian playing house. You lived in a fantasy world because she allowed it. But the charity ends today. Open the envelope and sign the relinquishment papers. Give us back the family equity and walk away." My chest tightened so hard I could barely pull air into my lungs. Relinquishment papers. Equity. What equity? I clutched the envelope tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Bradley, I do not know what you are talking about. Clara and I shared everything. We have a modest house and a joint checking account. What is there to relinquish?" Susan let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It was a terrible sound to hear over a grave. "A modest house. You really are an idiot, aren't you? Did you never look at a single piece of mail? Did you never wonder why your wife worked until midnight every single night? She was managing the family portfolio, Thomas. She was handling the real money. Money you have absolutely no right to." I felt physically dizzy. The ground beneath my cheap dress shoes felt like it was tilting. Clara was an accountant for a property firm. That was her job. She managed payroll and logistics. "No, Thomas." Bradley leaned in so close I could smell the expensive cologne radiating off his skin. "She managed my LLCs. She managed our capital. And right now, because of how she died, those assets are technically tied up in her estate. Your estate. And I am not going to let a glorified paper pusher hold my empire hostage. Sign the papers transferring all executive authority back to me. Now." I looked around wildly. The men in the suits were inching closer. They looked like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to stop breathing. The priest had quietly stepped away, clearly intimidated by the sheer wealth and aggression radiating from Bradley's group. I was completely alone. "You want me to sign legal documents right now?" I asked, my voice cracking. "My wife has not even been put in the ground yet. You want me to read a contract over her open grave?" "I do not care if you read it," Bradley snapped. "I care that you sign it. You have no claim to this money. You never earned a single dime of it. You sit in a basement all day reading old zoning permits while my sister did the real work. Sign the paper so we can get the banking frozen removed." I looked down at the envelope again. It felt like it was burning my hands. Grief is a strange thing. 10 minutes ago I was ready to collapse from the sorrow of losing my wife. Now a hot, blinding anger was beginning to rise in my throat. I did not understand the LLCs. I did not understand the money, but I understood disrespect. I understood that these people were violating the most sacred moment of my life. "No," I said. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay steady despite the violent shaking in my hands. I said, "No, I am not signing anything today. I am burying my wife. You can call me tomorrow. You can call me next week. But right now you need to step back." Susan stepped in front of Bradley. Her face twisted in fury. "You ungrateful little parasite! How dare you speak to us like that? We let you into this family." "You never let me into anything, Susan." I shot back, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "You treated me like a disease for 8 years. Clara was the only one who ever cared about me, and she is in that box. So you will respect her and you will back off." The silence that followed was suffocating. The rain beat down on the umbrellas in a steady, relentless rhythm. I stood my ground, holding the wet envelope, staring down the two people who had made my life miserable from the periphery. Bradley stared at me for a long, terrifying moment. His jaw muscles flexed. Then, slowly, a cruel, cold smile spread across his face. He reached out and tapped the envelope in my hands. "Have it your way, Thomas. Keep the papers. Read them tonight. But let me make something very clear to you. You think you are standing on solid ground. You think you have a house to go home to. You think you have a life left." He leaned in, dropping his voice to a whisper that only I could hear. "You do not know what she did. You do not know what she signed. You will not have a roof over your head by midnight." I stared at him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What is that supposed to mean? Bradley turned his back to me, ignoring my question. He opened his umbrella wider, shielding his mother. "We are leaving," he announced to the crowd. Instantly, the men in the suits turned and began walking toward the line of luxury SUVs. Susan gave me one last look of absolute contempt before turning on her expensive heels and following her son. They did not stay for the burial. They did not drop a flower into the grave. They simply marched back to their cars, leaving me standing alone in the mud. I watched the taillights of their vehicles fade into the gray, rainy distance. The cemetery was suddenly incredibly empty. Just me, the priest, and the groundskeepers waiting in the distance to do their job. I looked down at the thick envelope in my hands. The paper was saturated with rain, but the weight of it was undeniable. Bradley's words echoed in my ears. "You will not have a roof over your head by midnight." I thought it was just cruelty. I thought it was just the angry threat of a spoiled rich kid who did not get his way. I had a mortgage. I had a deed with my name on it. He could not touch my house. He could not touch my life. I placed my hand on the wet wood of Clara's casket, closing my eyes and letting the tears finally fall. I promised her I would figure it out. I promised her I would not let her family intimidate me. I turned and walked back to my 10-year-old Honda Civic. My clothes were heavy with water. I threw the envelope onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The heater blasted warm air, but I could not stop shivering. I put the car in drive and headed toward the modest suburban house I had shared with my wife. I was ready to go home. I was ready to lock the door, close the blinds, and grieve in peace. I was completely unaware that my home was already gone. I was completely unaware that the woman I had just buried had left behind a secret so massive it was about to destroy my entire existence. I drove through the rain, clutching the steering wheel, totally blind to the financial guillotine that had already been dropped on my neck. I pulled out of the cemetery gates and merged onto the highway. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers did nothing to calm my racing mind. I kept glancing at the manila envelope sitting on the passenger seat. The water from my clothes was soaking into the fabric of the car seats. I felt entirely hollowed out. How could I not know? That was the question looping endlessly in my brain. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of sharing coffee in the morning, of discussing utility bills, of planning for a future that we thought was simple and secure. If Clara was managing massive corporate portfolios for Bradley, why did we live paycheck to paycheck? Why did she complain about the price of gas? Why did we have to save up for 6 months just to buy a new washing machine? It was a level of deception that I simply could not process. I was a man who lived my life by the facts. As an archivist, my entire world was built on verification, on cross-checking records, on ensuring that the history written on the page matched the reality of the world. But the history of my own marriage was suddenly a giant blank space. Susan's voice echoed in my head again. "Did you never wonder why your wife worked until midnight every single night?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I had wondered. Of course I had. But Clara always had an explanation. Tax season, quarter-end reports, a demanding boss who refused to hire extra help. I believed her because I loved her. I believed her because when she came home exhausted, dropping her briefcase by the door, she would rest her head on my shoulder and tell me I was her safe place. Was that a lie too? Was I just a convenient prop in a life she was hiding from everyone else? The rain began to fall harder, turning the gray afternoon into a dark, murky twilight. I pressed my foot on the gas pedal, desperate to reach my house. I needed to get inside. I needed to go into Clara's home office and open her filing cabinets. I needed to find her laptop and tear through every digital file she owned. I was going to find out exactly what she had been doing for her brother. I was going to find out what was in that envelope. Bradley's threat felt like a cold shadow sitting in the back seat of my car. "You will not have a roof over your head by midnight." I told myself he was lying. I told myself it was impossible. But as I turned onto my street and saw the flashing yellow lights of a utility truck parked in my driveway, the first true spike of pure panic hit my bloodstream. I accelerated, my cheap tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. I did not know it yet, but the funeral was only the prologue. The real nightmare was waiting for me at my own front door. The thick manila envelope felt like a block of concrete against my chest. I stared down at it while the freezing rain soaked into the paper. It was heavy. It was official. It had a thick red legal seal pressed into the flap. I looked up from the envelope and stared directly into Bradley's eyes. I expected to see a brother mourning his sister. Instead, I saw a corporate predator staring at a roadblock. The priest had gone entirely silent. The soft murmurs of the funeral attendees died away. The only sound left in the world was the heavy rain hitting the black umbrellas of the 40 strangers surrounding my wife's grave. Bradley did not give me a second to catch my breath. He stepped so close to me that the edge of his custom umbrella bumped against my shoulder, dumping a stream of freezing water down my neck. He did not care. He tapped his finger aggressively against the wet envelope. "I said sign the papers, Thomas," he demanded. His voice was low, but it carried a sharp metallic edge. "We do not have time for your pathetic deer in the headlights routine today. Clara is gone. The charity program is officially over." I clutched the envelope with numb fingers. My throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. I could barely force the words out. "Charity program? Bradley, what are you talking about? We are burying my wife. We are standing 10 feet from her casket." Bradley let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of any human empathy. "Do not try to play the grieving widower with me. You think I care about your little tears. You think any of us are fooled by this act. Clara carried you for 8 years. You are a glorified librarian playing house in the suburbs. She let you pretend you were the man of the house while she did the real heavy lifting. Now the ride is over. Open the envelope. Sign the relinquishment papers. Give us back the family equity and walk away before I make this incredibly ugly for you." The words did not make any sense. They bounced around inside my head like a foreign language. Relinquishment papers, family equity. I stood there shivering in my cheap off-the-rack suit, trying to reconcile the man Bradley was describing with the life I had actually lived. "I am a municipal archivist. I make $58,000 a year." Clara was an accountant for a mid-level property firm. We drove 10-year-old cars. We clipped coupons. We spent our weekends painting the baseboards of our 3-bedroom house because we could not afford to hire a contractor. What equity was he talking about? What was there to relinquish? All we had was a joint checking account and a mortgage that we split right down the middle. Bradley, I stammered, taking a step back. I do not understand a single word you are saying. Clara and I built our life together. There is no family equity. We paid our bills month to month. If there is some kind of life insurance policy, we can talk about it later. Not here. Not now. That was when Susan stepped out from under the shadow of Bradley's umbrella. My mother-in-law had always hated me. From the day I married Clara, she made it perfectly clear that a city archivist was not fit to sit at her dinner table. She viewed my civil service job as a hobby for weak men, but she had always kept her venom wrapped in polite Southern passive aggression. Not today. Today the mask was completely off. Susan turned her body so she was facing not just me, but the entire crowd of high-powered strangers gathered around the gravesite. She raised her voice, projecting it over the storm. "Look at him," Susan declared, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Look at this pathetic excuse for a man. He actually believes he contributed something to my daughter's life." I felt the blood rush to my face. The strangers in the expensive suits shifted their gazes toward me. I could feel their collective judgment burning into my skin. Susan pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my chest. "You are a parasite, Thomas. You have always been a parasite. You could never provide for her. You could never give her the life she deserved. Did you really think your pathetic little government paycheck paid for anything? Did you really think a woman like Clara was satisfied clipping coupons with a loser who sorts dusty papers for a living? She was managing our assets. She was protecting our wealth from your grubby little hands. And now that she is gone, you think you are going to sink your teeth into our money. You make me sick to my stomach." The public humiliation was paralyzing. My knees felt weak. I looked at the faces of the strangers. Some of the men were actually smirking. They were looking at me like I was a beggar who had wandered into an exclusive country club. They were treating me like a criminal at my own wife's funeral. I wanted to scream. I wanted to defend the 8 years of marriage I had shared with Clara. I wanted to tell Susan about the nights Clara would fall asleep on my chest while we watched cheap movies. I wanted to tell her about the anniversary trips we took to public parks because we could not afford luxury resorts. We were happy. We were deeply, genuinely happy. But looking at the absolute conviction in Susan's eyes, a terrifying sliver of doubt began to pierce through my grief. What if I did not know my own wife? What if these people standing in the rain with their luxury SUVs and custom suits knew a version of Clara that I had never met? The envelope in my hands felt heavier than ever. It felt like a bomb waiting to go off. Bradley snapped his fingers. One of the men in the dark suits immediately stepped forward. He did not say a word. He just reached into his tailored jacket and produced a sleek silver pen. He handed the pen to Bradley and stepped back into the crowd. Bradley held the pen out to me. "I am done talking to you, Thomas. The probate clock is ticking and my accounts are vulnerable. We are going to walk over to the hood of my car right now. You are going to take the papers out of that envelope. You are going to sign on the dotted lines and renounce your status as the executor of her estate. If you do that right now, I will let you walk away with the pathetic little house you think you own. If you refuse, I will destroy you." I looked at the silver pen hovering in the space between us. I looked at the hood of Bradley's glossy black Range Rover parked a few yards away. They wanted me to sign away my legal rights on the hood of a car while my wife's body was waiting to be lowered into the dirt. They wanted to erase my marriage before the ink on her death certificate was even dry. A wave of nausea washed over me, followed instantly by a surge of pure protective anger. I might not make 6 figures. I might not wear a Tom Ford suit. But I was Clara's husband. I was the man she chose. I was the man who held her hand in the emergency room. I was the man who had to identify her body. I had earned the right to stand here as her husband, and I was not going to be bullied by a pair of arrogant predators. I took a slow, deep breath. I pushed the silver pen away with the back of my hand. No, I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It came out deeper and firmer than I expected. Bradley's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. Excuse me, what did you just say to me? I said no, I repeated, stepping forward so I was right in his face. I am not signing a single piece of paper today. I do not care about your equity. I do not care about your LLCs or your probate clocks. I am burying my wife. The woman I love is in that casket, and you are treating her like a bad investment. You are sick. Both of you are sick. Get out of my face. Susan gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had been physically struck. You arrogant little nobody. How dare you speak to us like that? I dare. Because this is my wife's funeral, I fired back. Not your corporate boardroom. You want me to sign legal documents. Have your lawyers call me next week. Send them to my house. But if you push that pen in my face one more time, I am going to throw it into that open grave. The men in the suits tensed. Two of them actually stepped forward, closing the distance as if they were prepared to physically restrain me. I held my ground. My heart was hammering wildly against my ribs, but I refused to break eye contact with Bradley. I refused to let them see how terrified I actually was. Bradley held up a hand, signaling the men in suits to stop. He slowly lowered the silver pen, slipping it back into his pocket. The mocking sneer dropped entirely from his face, leaving behind a mask of cold, calculating rage. He looked at me not like a human being, but like a pest that needed to be exterminated. Have it your way, Thomas Bradley said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than if he had yelled. You want to play the proud husband. You want to pretend you hold any cards in this game. That is fine. Take the envelope home. Read the papers. Read every single line. He took one step back, adjusting the lapels of his expensive suit. The rain continued to pour down, washing the mud over the toes of my cheap shoes. But let me give you a little piece of advice, Bradley continued, his tone dripping with absolute certainty. You think you know what you are refusing. You think you are protecting your modest little life. You have absolutely no idea what Clara actually did. You have no idea what she signed her name to. You think you are safe because you pay a mortgage. He leaned in close again. His breath was hot against my cold skin. You will not have a roof over your head by midnight. And when the bank locks your doors, do not even think about calling us for help. Bradley turned his back on me. He took his mother by the arm and guided her away from the grave. Susan did not look back. The entire congregation of suited strangers turned in unison and followed them toward the line of luxury vehicles. They left the cemetery, completely abandoning the burial service. I stood there entirely alone beside the grave of my wife. My hands were gripping the wet manila envelope so tightly my joints ached. I watched the taillights of the black SUVs illuminate the rainy afternoon as they drove out of the cemetery gates. You will not have a roof over your head by midnight. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the words from my brain. It was a bluff. It had to be an empty threat designed to scare me into compliance. I had paid the mortgage on time every single month for 8 years. The deed to the house had my name on it. Bradley was a real estate developer, not a god. He could not magically snap his fingers and take away my home. I turned back to the casket. I whispered a final goodbye to Clara, my chest heaving with silent sobs. I promised her I would protect whatever life we had left. I promised her I would not let her family erase our history. I turned and walked through the mud toward my beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. My clothes were dripping wet. The heater roared to life, but it did nothing to stop the bone-deep chill radiating through my body. I tossed the thick manila envelope onto the passenger seat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the cemetery. I just wanted to go home. I just wanted to walk through my front door, lock the deadbolt, and collapse onto our bed. I thought the worst part of my day was over. I thought nothing could be more painful than burying my wife. I had absolutely no idea that Bradley was not bluffing. I had no idea that the modest life I was driving back to had already been completely dismantled. The drive from the cemetery to my house was a blur of gray rain and blinding headlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Honda Civic so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I tried to focus on the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I needed the comfort of the oak trees and the cracked sidewalks I walked every single morning. I needed to see the porch light I always left on for Clara. I turned onto my street and my heart immediately sank into my stomach. There was a massive white utility van parked directly in my driveway. The rain was washing over its roof, but I could clearly see the logo of a property management company painted on the side. 2 men in heavy yellow raincoats were standing on my front porch. One of them was holding a clipboard. The other was drilling something directly into the wood of my front door. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to a halt right behind their van. I threw the door open and stepped out into the freezing rain, ignoring the fact that my suit was already completely soaked. "Hey!" I shouted, running up the wet driveway. "What are you doing? Get away from my door!" The man with the drill stopped and turned around. He looked at me with the bored, exhausted expression of someone who dealt with angry people for a living. The man with the clipboard stepped forward, shielding his paperwork from the rain. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked. "Yes, I am the homeowner," I yelled, stepping onto the porch. "My name is Thomas. My wife and I bought this house 8 years ago. You are trespassing. Get off my property right now." The man with the clipboard did not flinch. He just pulled a thick, laminated sheet of paper from his stack and handed it to me. "Not anymore, buddy," he said quietly. "We are executing a bank-mandated lockout. The property has been officially seized by the Commercial Lending Division. You have 24 hours to contact the asset recovery firm to arrange for the retrieval of your personal items. After that, everything inside goes to auction." I stared at the laminated paper in my hands. The heavy black letters screamed the word foreclosure at the top. Beneath it was the logo of a massive national bank. It listed the property address. It listed the parcel number, and right there at the bottom it listed the date of seizure. Today. "This is a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "This is a massive legal mistake. I pay my mortgage on the 1st of every single month. I have never missed a payment in 8 years. I have the receipts in my office. You need to take that drill away from my door right now." The worker shook his head. "Look, man, I do not handle the billing. I just secure the properties. The bank issued the order this morning. The electronic locks are already changed and we are putting the secondary padlock on now. If you try to force your way through the front door, I am legally required to call the police. Take it up with the bank tomorrow." They turned their backs to me and finished installing a heavy steel padlock right over the brass handle I had polished just last week. They slapped a bright neon orange legal sticker across the glass pane of the door. Then they walked right past me, got into their utility van, and drove away into the rain. I stood on my own front porch, completely locked out of my own life. Bradley's voice echoed in my head with terrifying clarity. "You will not have a roof over your head by midnight." He knew. He knew exactly what was going to happen today. He timed it perfectly so that the bank would seize my house while I was standing over my wife's open grave. A sudden, violent surge of panic ripped through my chest. I could not wait until tomorrow. I could not stand on the porch and just accept that my house was gone. I needed my financial documents. I needed the bank statements I kept filed away in the bottom drawer of my desk. I needed to prove that I owned this house. I ran around the side of the house, slipping in the wet grass. The wooden gate to the backyard was swollen from the rain, but I kicked it open with my heel. I moved toward the back of the house where the small window to my home office looked out over the yard. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of my desk inside. I did not care about the alarms. I did not care about the police. I took off my wetsuit jacket, wrapped it tightly around my right fist, and smashed my hand directly through the glass pane of the office window. The glass shattered inward with a loud crash. I reached carefully through the jagged edges, unlocked the latch, and shoved the window upward. I pulled myself over the sill, tumbling headfirst into the dark room. I landed hard on the hardwood floor, cutting my knee on a stray shard of glass, but I did not stop moving. I scrambled up to my desk and yanked the chain of the desk lamp. The room bathed in a warm yellow glow, highlighting the framed pictures of Clara and me sitting on the shelves. My stomach twisted with a sickening combination of grief and terror. I pushed the pictures aside and booted up my computer. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I navigated to my online banking portal. I typed in my username and password. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. The screen finally refreshed. I stared at the dashboard. Our joint checking account, which was supposed to hold exactly $4,000 for our monthly expenses, showed a balance of $0. Our savings account, which held the $14,000 we had painstakingly saved for emergencies, showed a balance of $0. A bright red banner spanned the top of the web page. It read account frozen. Status delinquent. Please contact asset recovery. I grabbed my cell phone from my pocket, leaving wet fingerprints on the screen. I dialed the customer service number listed on the red banner. The automated system kept me on hold for 20 agonizing minutes. I paced back and forth in the small office, bleeding slightly onto the floor, listening to the cheerful corporate hold music while my entire reality crumbled around me. Finally, a human voice clicked onto the line. Thank you for calling Commercial Lending. This is Sarah. How can I help you today? My name is Thomas, I said, rushing the words out. I just got home from burying my wife and there is a padlock on my front door. My accounts are completely frozen. Someone has made a catastrophic mistake. I need you to look up my file and fix this immediately. I pay my mortgage on time every single month. I hear how stressful that must be, sir, the representative said, using that perfectly trained, calm customer service voice. Let me pull up the property address and the primary social security number on the account. I recited the numbers, pacing faster. I waited while I heard her typing on her end. Okay, Mr. Thomas, she said. I have your file open. I am looking at the payment history for your primary mortgage. You are correct. The primary mortgage of $210,000 is perfectly current. There are no missed payments on that loan. I stopped pacing. A wave of relief washed over me. Then tell the asset recovery team to take the padlock off my door. Tell them to unfreeze my checking account. Sir, she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. The primary mortgage is not what triggered the asset seizure. The default was triggered by the secondary loan. The home equity line of credit is currently 90 days past due. Because that loan is cross-collateralized with your liquid accounts, the bank has executed a total asset freeze. I stood completely still. The silence in the house was suddenly deafening. What line of credit? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. We do not have a line of credit. We only have the primary mortgage. The representative paused. I hear typing again. Sir, the records show a massive draw against the equity of the property. A home equity line of credit was originated 26 months ago. The limit on the account was $600,000. $600,000. The number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. That was more than the house was even worth. That was more money than I would make in a decade as an archivist. I never signed for that. I shouted into the phone, panic fully taking over. That is fraud. That is identity theft. I never authorized a secondary loan against my home. Sir, we have the origination documents right here in the digital vault, she replied, her tone turning strictly professional. The paperwork was signed and legally notarized. Your signature is on page 3, right next to your wife's signature. My legs gave out. I collapsed into the chair behind my desk, staring blankly at the dark computer screen. Clara. Clara was an accountant. Clara managed all our taxes. Clara was the one who insisted on checking the mail every afternoon. She was the one who balanced the checkbook and filed the paperwork. She knew my signature better than I did. She knew exactly how to replicate it. Where did the money go? I asked, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cold cheeks. If there was $600,000 taken out of my house, where did it go? I can view the wire transfer history for the account, she said. It looks like the funds were not withdrawn as cash. They were transferred directly into external corporate accounts over the course of 2 years. Read me the names of the accounts, I demanded. She rattled off a list of corporate entities. Horizon Holdings, LLC. Crestview Property Development, Vanguard Regional Management. Every single name she read was a company owned by Bradley. I recognized them from the whispers at the funeral. I recognized them from the fancy letterheads on the mail Bradley occasionally sent to our house. My dead wife had systematically stolen every single penny of equity out of our home. She had forged my signature, committed massive financial fraud, and funneled $600,000 directly into her brother's real estate empire. That is why she worked until midnight. That is why she was always exhausted. She was not protecting our modest middle-class life. She was robbing me blind to fund her family's lavish lifestyle. Sir, the representative continued, completely unaware that she was delivering a death sentence. Because the total debt now exceeds the value of the collateral, the bank has accelerated the loan. The entire balance of $600,000 is due immediately. Until that balance is paid, the house remains bank property, and your liquid accounts remain frozen. I highly suggest you retain legal counsel. I did not answer her. I let the phone slip out of my hand. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. I could still hear her tiny voice calling my name through the speaker, but I could not bring myself to pick it up. I looked around the small office. I looked at the books I had carefully arranged on the shelves. I looked at the framed wedding photo sitting on my desk. In the picture, Clara was smiling, leaning her head against my shoulder. She looked so happy. She looked so safe. It was all a lie. Every coupon we clipped, every vacation we skipped, every night I brought her tea while she hunched over her laptop claiming she was doing extra work for her boss. It was all a carefully constructed theater designed to keep me completely in the dark while she drained my financial blood to feed her brother. Bradley was right. I was a librarian playing house. Clara carried me. But she did not carry me because she loved me. She carried me because I was the perfect blind fool. I was the perfect cover story. Who would ever suspect a modest city archivist and his quiet accountant wife of moving $600,000 of fraudulent money? Everything I thought I owned was collateral for my brother-in-law's empire. My house was gone. My savings were gone. My credit was destroyed. I walked over to the window I had just broken. The rain was blowing sideways through the jagged hole in the glass, soaking the rug on the floor. The cold air ripped through the room, chilling me to my bones. I was 36 years old. I was entirely alone in the world. I was officially homeless, and I had just been utterly and completely betrayed by the woman I was actively mourning. I realized then why Bradley and Susan were so aggressive at the cemetery. They were not just being cruel, they were terrified. Because Clara was dead, the massive fraudulent loan was going to come under the scrutiny of the probate courts. The bank was going to start looking into where the money went. Bradley needed me to sign those relinquishment papers because he needed to legally detach his LLCs from the toxic debt Clara had created under my name. If I signed those papers, I would be taking 100% of the criminal and financial liability for a $600,000 theft. I would go to federal prison while Bradley and Susan kept the money. I stood in the freezing dark office, shivering uncontrollably. I looked down at the blood dripping from my cut knee onto the floorboards of a house I no longer owned. I had to leave. If the police drove by and saw the broken window, they would arrest me for breaking and entering into bank property. I grabbed my wetsuit jacket off the floor. I did not take any files. I did not take any clothes. I did not even take the framed photo of Clara. I climbed back out the broken window, stepping out into the mud of the backyard. I walked around to the front of the house. I looked at the heavy steel padlock on the door one last time. Then I walked down the driveway, getting back into my freezing car. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but finally caught. I pulled out of the driveway and drove into the dark, rainy night with absolutely nowhere to go. The first night in my 2012 Honda Civic was a masterclass in human misery and degradation. The rain from the cemetery had finally stopped, but the temperature had plummeted, plunging the city into a bitter, biting cold. I parked my car in the far dark corner of a 24-hour grocery store parking lot, hoping the bright neon lights from the storefront would deter anyone from bothering me. I had to keep turning the engine on every 2 hours just to run the heater long enough to stop my teeth from chattering. The gas needle was hovering dangerously close to empty, and I had no money to refill the tank. I curled up in the cramped back seat, wearing the exact same cheap suit I had worn to bury my wife. The damp fabric clung to my skin like a layer of ice. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara. I saw her smiling at me across our small kitchen table, holding a mug of cheap coffee. I saw her laughing as we painted the walls of the house we supposedly owned together. Then the image of her face would be violently replaced by the massive red banner on my banking app. Account frozen. Status delinquent. She had stolen $600,000 from the very home we slept in. The betrayal sat in my chest like a physical lead weight, making it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath. I was 36 years old and I had absolutely nothing. No wife, no home, no money, just a half tank of gas and a growing, suffocating knot of pure panic in my stomach. When the sun finally came up, painting the sky in a dull, bruised gray, I felt completely hollowed out. My back screamed in sharp, agonizing pain from sleeping awkwardly across the seatbelts. My stomach growled loudly, a harsh reminder that I had not eaten a single thing since a piece of dry toast on the morning of the funeral. I climbed into the front seat and drove to a nearby public park. I walked into the freezing concrete public restroom and washed my face in the icy sink water. I tried to smooth out the severe wrinkles in my damp suit. I tied my necktie with shaking fingers. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror above the sink and tried to find the man I was just 24 hours ago. I failed completely. The man staring back at me looked like a ghost. But I had one thing left. I had my job. As a municipal archivist for the city, I had a small, quiet office filled with historical zoning permits, property maps, and tax records. It was my absolute sanctuary. I figured if I could just get to my desk, I could sit in the quiet and formulate a plan. I could call legal aid. I could explain the massive forgery to the police department. I clung to the idea of my job like a man drowning in the middle of the ocean clinging to a piece of driftwood. I drove to the city annex building and parked my car. I walked through the double glass doors, keeping my head down, praying nobody would notice the mud caked on my shoes or the deep dark circles under my eyes. I barely made it to my desk before the phone on my cubicle wall rang. It was not a colleague asking about a historical property file. It was the director of human resources. She asked me to come to her office immediately. My heart pounded a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs as I walked down the fluorescent-lit hallway. When I walked into the human resources office, the director did not offer me a seat. She looked at me with a mixture of distant pity and severe professional irritation. She did not ask about the funeral I had attended the day before. She did not offer her condolences for Clara. Instead, she pushed a thick stack of pink telephone message slips across her polished wooden desk. She told me that starting at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the city switchboard had been completely flooded with aggressive phone calls, debt collectors. But they were not normal corporate collection agents. They were private, aggressive fixers hired by Bradley and his real estate associates. They had intentionally tied up the city phone lines, demanding to speak to me regarding a massive financial default. They had told the young city clerks answering the phones that I was deeply involved in a $600,000 federal fraud case. They threatened to send aggressive process servers to the city annex building to disrupt government business until I paid what I owed. The director folded her hands on her desk and told me that the city municipal office could not be associated with this level of public financial scandal. She said they were funded by taxpayer dollars and could not afford the liability or the severe disruption to the workplace. She told me I was being placed on indefinite unpaid administrative leave pending a full legal investigation into my financial conduct. I tried to beg. I completely swallowed my pride and pleaded with her. I tried to explain that my wife had secretly forged my signature on a home equity line of credit. I tried to explain that I was a victim of my wealthy brother-in-law and his predatory business tactics. The director just shook her head, her expression hardening. She stated that personal domestic disputes involving hundreds of thousands of missing dollars were not the city's problem. She asked me to hand over my building keys and my official security badge immediately. Within 10 minutes of walking into the building, trying to salvage the last piece of my dignity, I was being escorted right back out by a uniformed security guard in front of all my coworkers. I walked back to my car in an absolute daze. The sun was shining brightly now, but my entire world felt entirely black. I had lost the only income I had left. I had lost the only safe place I could go to escape the nightmare of my reality. I opened the door of my Honda Civic and collapsed heavily into the driver's seat. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel and let out a loud, ragged, agonizing sob. I was completely and utterly broken. I had no money for food. I had no money for gas. I had no legal representation. I was a man entirely erased from society in less than 2 days. My cell phone vibrated violently in my suit pocket. I pulled it out, expecting to see a notification from the bank or maybe another harassing call from a predatory collection agency. The caller screen simply displayed the name Bradley. A fresh wave of hot, blinding anger washed over me, temporarily pushing away the despair. I wiped my eyes and answered the call, putting it on speakerphone. I wanted to scream at him, but my throat was too dry. Before I could even manage to form a word, Bradley spoke. His voice was smooth, calm, and dripping with absolute victory. "How did you sleep, Thomas?" he asked. "I hear the back seat of an old Honda Civic is not nearly as comfortable as the memory foam mattress you used to have in your master bedroom." I froze completely. I looked around the parking lot, suddenly terrified and paranoid that one of his hired men was sitting in a car nearby watching my every move. "How do you know where I am?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a potent mix of fear and fury. "Did you have me followed? Did you call my job and get me fired?" Bradley laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound that echoed through the small cabin of my car. "I told you yesterday, Thomas. You have absolutely no idea how this game is played. You have no idea what real power looks like. Clara played the game perfectly for years. She took the money from the house. She funneled it to the right corporate accounts. And she left you holding the bag of toxic debt. Now you are sitting in a public parking lot with $0 in your account and no job to go to. I hear the municipal government does not take kindly to their quiet little archivists being involved in $600,000 bank frauds. You did this, I shouted, finally, finding my voice and hitting the steering wheel with my closed fist. You forced her to do this. You are ruining my life for money you already stole from my home. Bradley did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout. He had all the power and he knew it perfectly well. I am giving you a way out, he said smoothly. I am offering you mercy because I am a generous man and because my mother wants this ugly little chapter of our family history permanently closed. You are starving, Thomas. You are freezing. You smell like wet dog and failure. And by tomorrow morning, the bank is going to file official federal fraud charges against you for the massive home equity line of credit. When the police look at the origination documents, they are going to see your signature right there next to Clara's. You will go to federal prison. You will absolutely not survive federal prison. He let the heavy silence hang in the air for a long moment, letting the reality of his threat sink deep into my exhausted bones. He was right. I had no defense. Then he offered the final, ultimate blow. Here is the deal. Bradley continued, his tone completely devoid of any human emotion. You are going to come to my lawyer's office. You are going to sign the estate relinquishment papers, completely transferring all ownership of the limited liability companies back to me. You will legally accept sole responsibility for the massive debt on the house. In exchange, I will hand you a leather briefcase containing exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash. You will take that money, drive out of this state, and never contact my family ever again. I gripped the phone so tightly the plastic casing creaked. You want me to take the fall for your financial crimes? I asked, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. You want me to walk away with nothing but $10,000 while you keep everything my wife stole for you? You want me to carry the debt, so your hands look clean. Bradley sighed heavily into the receiver as if he was speaking to a very slow, stubborn child. $10,000 is an absolute fortune for a homeless, unemployed man, Thomas. If you do not sign, my lawyers will make sure the police know exactly where you are parked right now. You will be arrested for fraud before the sun sets tomorrow. Sign the estate over to us completely. I will give you $10,000 cash to start over in some other state. Do not sign, and my lawyers will have you arrested for the fraudulent loan your wife took out. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. You do not have the stamina for this fight. I sat in the profound silence of my car, listening to the steady hum of the traffic on the busy street nearby. My stomach cramped with intense, painful hunger. I had absolutely no money to satisfy. My body ached from the freezing cold temperatures. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling violently, unable to stay still. I thought about fighting back. I thought about driving to the local police station and trying to explain the forgery to a detective. But who would possibly believe me? I had absolutely no proof. Clara was dead and buried. The bank had my verified signature on file for the loan. Bradley had millions of dollars to spend on aggressive, ruthless lawyers who would easily bury me in a courtroom. I was just a fired municipal worker with a ruined suit, a broken car, and a destroyed life. The crushing reality of my situation broke whatever fragile pride I had left. I had been completely outmatched. I had been outplayed by a wife I foolishly trusted and a family that viewed me as disposable trash from the very beginning. I had no moves left on the board. I was trapped in a corner with a financial guillotine hanging directly over my neck. "Fine," I whispered, my voice cracking terribly in the quiet car. "Fine, I will sign your papers." "I knew you would finally see reason," Thomas Bradley replied, the smug, overwhelming satisfaction radiating through the phone speaker. "Be at the downtown penthouse office of my legal team in exactly 48 hours. 10 in the morning sharp. Dress nicely. We do not want you leaving stains on the expensive leather chairs in the lobby." He hung up the phone without another word. The line went dead, leaving a quiet dial tone ringing in my ears. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat right next to the wet manila envelope I had carried away from the cemetery. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes tight. I was starving. I was freezing. I was utterly and completely broken in every single way a man could be broken. I had just agreed to meet my absolute greatest enemy in 48 hours to voluntarily sign my entire life and future away. I had completely surrendered. I thought this was the absolute bitter end of my story. I thought Bradley had won everything there was to win. As I sat in that freezing car waiting for the hours to pass, I had absolutely no idea that my pathetic surrender was exactly what needed to happen for the real, hidden truth to finally find me. I sat in the driver's seat of my Honda Civic, watching the frost gather on the inside of the windshield. The 48-hour countdown was ticking away in my head. I had roughly 30 hours left before I had to walk into that downtown penthouse office and sign my entire life over to the man who ruined me. My stomach was a hollow cavern of pain. I had managed to scrape together enough loose change from the floorboards to buy a single cup of black coffee from a gas station. It was currently sitting in the cup holder, providing the only source of warmth in my entire universe. I rubbed my hands together, trying to force some circulation back into my numb fingers. I felt like a stray dog waiting for the animal control truck to finally arrive. A sharp rap on the driver's side window made me jump. I snapped my head around, fully expecting to see one of Bradley's hired men coming to intimidate me before the meeting. Instead, I saw an older woman standing in the bitter wind. She was wearing a thick wool coat and a knitted scarf pulled up tight around her neck. She was holding a large, battered cardboard box against her chest. I did not immediately recognize her, but her eyes held a soft, familiar kindness that Bradley's people simply did not possess. I cranked the manual window down a few inches. The freezing air rushed into the car. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. "I am so sorry to bother you. My name is Helen. I worked with Clara at the property management firm. We shared a wall for 6 years. I stared at her, completely caught off guard. Helen. I had heard that name. Clara used to mention a Helen who brought homemade baked goods to the office on Fridays. But hearing anything about Clara's work life now just filled me with a sickening sense of dread. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice raspy and weak. Helen looked down at the muddy pavement, then back up at me. "The police officer who took your report about the house lockout is my nephew," she explained softly. "He mentioned your car and the license plate. I have been driving around these lots for 2 hours looking for you. I had to bring you this." She shifted the heavy cardboard box, pushing it slightly toward the open window. I rolled the window down the rest of the way and took the box from her. The cardboard was damp and smelled like rotting garbage and stale rain. "What is this?" I asked, staring down at the crumpled flaps. Helen wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "It is Clara's things," she said. "Yesterday, right after the funeral, a team of men in expensive suits came into our office. They had security badges and corporate legal orders. They completely bypassed human resources and went straight to Clara's desk. They did not even let me speak to them. They tore her cubicle apart, Thomas. They brought in digital forensic teams and ripped the hard drive right out of her computer. They packed every single corporate file into steel lockboxes." Helen paused, wiping a tear from her wrinkled cheek. "But they did not care about her personal items." I watched one of the men in a tailored gray suit sweep his arm across her desk and knock all her photos and knickknacks straight into a plastic trash bag. He called it useless garbage. When they left, I went out to the alley behind the building. They threw the bag right into the industrial dumpster. I climbed in and dug it out. "I thought you should have it." "I know how much she loved you, Thomas. She talked about you every single day." I looked at Helen and felt a massive surge of conflicting emotions. This sweet older woman had climbed into a dumpster to retrieve the memories of a woman she thought was a dedicated, loving wife. She had absolutely no idea that her desk neighbor was a master financial forger who had stolen $600,000 and funded a massive criminal real estate empire. She did not know the monster Clara really was. I could not bring myself to ruin Helen's memory of her. "Thank you, Helen," I said, my voice cracking. "You did not have to do this. I appreciate it. I really do." Helen gave me a sad, sympathetic smile. "You take care of yourself, Thomas," she whispered. She turned and walked away, pulling her coat tight against the wind, leaving me alone with a box of trash. I pulled the box over the center console and set it on the passenger seat, right where the manila envelope of relinquishment papers had been sitting yesterday. I stared at the closed flaps. I did not want to open it. I did not want to look at the remnants of a fake life. I wanted to throw the entire box into the nearest gutter and drive away. But the twisted, agonizing grief in my chest forced my hands forward. I pulled back the damp cardboard flaps. The first thing I saw was a handful of cheap plastic ballpoint pens scattered across the bottom. They were the cheap bulk pens you buy at a dollar store. I picked one up, rolling it between my fingers. Why would a woman secretly moving hundreds of thousands of dollars for a millionaire real estate developer use cheap dollar store pens? Bradley wore Tom Ford suits and solid gold watches. Why was his sister the mastermind behind his financial liquidity, sitting in a cubicle using pens that leaked ink onto her fingers? It was just another bizarre contradiction in the web of lies my wife had constructed. I tossed the pen back into the box and dug deeper. My hand brushed against something soft and textured. I pulled it out and my breath hitched painfully in my throat. It was a small, heavily worn leather journal. The edges of the leather were frayed and the binding was loose from years of use. I recognized it instantly. I had bought this exact journal for Clara on our first wedding anniversary. We did not have the money for expensive gifts back then, so I bought her this notebook and wrote a love letter on the very first page. I told her that no matter how hard life got, we would always write our story together. My hands shook violently as I opened the cover. There on the first page was my own handwriting. My own naive, stupid words promising to love and protect a woman who would eventually leave me homeless and freezing in a grocery store parking lot. I flipped through the pages. Clara had actually used it, but she had not written a diary. She had used it to keep the small romantic sticky notes I used to leave on the bathroom mirror for her. Every time I wrote her a note telling her to have a great day or telling her how beautiful she looked, she had carefully taken it down and taped it into this leather journal. The pages were filled with my devotion to her. A hot, bitter tear dropped from my chin and splashed directly onto one of the sticky notes, smudging the blue ink. It was an unbearable psychological torture. Looking at this journal, looking at the obsessive care she took to preserve my silly little love notes, completely shattered my mind. If she was a cold, calculating thief who only used me as a blind financial cover story, why would she keep this? Why would she hide a book of my love notes in her desk at work? It made absolutely zero sense. I slammed the journal shut and threw it hard into the back seat. I could not look at it anymore. I could not let myself fall back into the trap of loving her. She was a fraud. She was a criminal. She had stolen my home. I had to remember the facts. I reached into the bottom of the damp cardboard box, intending to dump the rest of the contents onto the floorboards. But my fingers wrapped around a heavy glass object. I pulled it out into the dim morning light. It was a snow globe. The glass dome was thick and slightly cloudy. Inside the dome was a cheap painted plastic replica of a cabin in the Smoky Mountains. We had gone to the Smoky Mountains for our honeymoon. We drove my old car all the way from our state, sleeping in cheap motels because we could not afford airplane tickets or luxury resorts. We bought this snow globe at a roadside gas station for $8. Clara had laughed so hard when she bought it, claiming it was the tackiest thing she had ever seen, but she promised to keep it on her desk forever to remind her of our perfect trip. I stared at the little plastic cabin. The water inside the globe had evaporated over the years, leaving the fake snow clumped at the bottom. The resin base was chipped and faded. I held the snow globe in my right hand, feeling the weight of the glass. The anger that had been simmering in my gut suddenly boiled over into a blinding, white-hot rage. This cheap $8 piece of garbage was the perfect symbol of my entire miserable marriage. She sat at her desk, staring at this tacky souvenir, pretending to be a humble middle-class wife, all while quietly signing her name to a $600,000 fraudulent loan. She let me believe we were poor. She let me worry about the grocery bill. She let me stress over the price of a new set of tires while she was secretly funneling a fortune to Bradley. "You lied to me," I screamed, the sound tearing through my raw throat. "You lied about everything." I pulled my arm back and hurled the snow globe with every single ounce of strength and fury I had left in my exhausted body. I did not aim. I just wanted to destroy it. I wanted to smash the physical manifestation of her lies into a million tiny pieces. The heavy glass object flew across the small cabin of the car and slammed violently against the hard plastic of the steering column. The impact was incredibly loud in the confined space. The thick glass dome shattered instantly, exploding into dozens of jagged fragments that rained down onto the floor mats and my shoes. The painted plastic cabin snapped off its mount and bounced into the passenger seat. The heavy solid resin base dropped straight down, landing perfectly between my feet. I sat there panting, my chest heaving, struggling to catch my breath. The violent physical outburst did nothing to relieve the crushing pressure in my chest. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my ruined suit jacket, letting out a long, defeated groan. I leaned forward to pick up the broken pieces of glass so I would not cut my feet. I reached down and picked up the heavy resin base of the shattered snow globe. As I turned the heavy base over in my hands, my fingers brushed against something extremely unnatural. The base was not completely solid. The impact against the steering column had cracked the thick resin right down the middle, splitting it cleanly in half. Tucked perfectly inside a hollowed-out cavity in the very center of the resin base was a small black cylindrical object. I frowned, my heart suddenly skipping a beat. I wedged my thumb into the crack and pulled the two halves of the heavy resin base completely apart. The black object popped out and rolled into the palm of my hand. It was a waterproof metal capsule, the kind you might use to keep emergency matches dry on a camping trip. It had a threaded cap with a small rubber sealing ring. Why would an $8 gas station snow globe have a waterproof metal capsule physically embedded and sealed inside its solid base? It was not a manufacturing error. Someone had purposefully drilled out the bottom of the resin, inserted this capsule, and sealed it back up. Clara had done this. She had kept this cheap, tacky souvenir sitting right out in the open on her desk for 8 years, directly under the noses of her corporate bosses and her brother. Bradley's men had literally thrown it into a dumpster, thinking it was useless garbage. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the smooth metal. I pinched the bottom of the capsule with my left hand and grabbed the threaded cap with my right. I twisted hard. The rubber seal gave way with a soft, popping sound. I unscrewed the cap completely and tipped the open end of the cylinder into my open palm. A tiny silver square slid out of the dark metal tube and clinked against my skin. I stared down at it, my mind racing a million miles an hour, trying to process what I was looking at. It was a high-capacity micro USB flash drive. The freezing cold of the car completely vanished. The agonizing hunger in my stomach instantly disappeared. I was holding a hidden digital drive that my wife had gone to extreme lengths to conceal inside an object she knew her arrogant, wealthy brother would view as utterly worthless trash. Bradley thought she had left me nothing but toxic debt and a foreclosure notice. Bradley thought he had secured every single piece of evidence when his men ripped her hard drive out of her computer. I stared at the tiny silver drive resting in the palm of my dirty, shivering hand. This was not a box of worthless scraps. This was a message, and judging by the extreme level of paranoid security Clara had used to hide it, this little silver drive contained something that was going to change absolutely everything. I just needed to find a computer to see exactly what my dead wife had left behind for me. I drove my battered Civic straight to the downtown public library, taking back roads to avoid any main intersections where Bradley might have people watching. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my forearms ached. The tiny silver flash drive felt like a burning coal inside my damp suit pocket. I parked 3 blocks away in a paid municipal lot and walked the rest of the distance through the freezing rain. I kept my head down, pulling my wet collar up around my neck. I felt like a fugitive in my own city. The library was quiet and smelled of old paper and floor wax. It was exactly the kind of environment I spent my entire career working in. A few elderly people were reading newspapers at the front tables. A couple of high school students were huddled in the corner. I walked past the main circulation desk, keeping my face turned away from the security cameras, and headed straight for the public computer terminals in the back. I found an isolated terminal tucked behind a row of heavy reference encyclopedias. I sat down in the hard plastic chair. My clothes were still dripping wet, leaving a small puddle on the linoleum floor. I pulled the cheap plastic headphones attached to the monitor and placed them over my ears. The synthetic leather pads were peeling, but I did not care. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the micro USB drive. My fingers were trembling so violently I missed the computer port twice before finally sliding the metal drive into the slot. The computer screen blinked. A small window popped up on the monitor indicating a removable drive had been detected. I grabbed the computer mouse. My heart was slamming against my ribs with terrifying force. I clicked on the folder. There was only one file on the entire drive. It was a video file. The title of the file was simply my name. Thomas. I hovered the mouse cursor over the file icon. I could not breathe. For a fleeting second, I was absolutely terrified of what I was about to see. What if this was a video of her mocking me? What if this was a confession of multiple affairs? What if this was the final ultimate proof that my 8-year marriage was a complete and total illusion? I squeezed my eyes shut, prayed for the strength to survive whatever was coming next and double-clicked the mouse. The screen went black for a second. Then a video window opened and Clara appeared on the screen. A sharp, agonized gasp escaped my throat. I slapped my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out loud in the quiet library. There she was, my beautiful wife. She was sitting in the driver's seat of her car, parked in what looked like an empty concrete parking garage. The timestamp in the bottom corner of the video read Tuesday at 11 at night. That was exactly 3 days before her fatal car crash. She looked absolutely exhausted. Her face was incredibly pale, and there were dark, heavy bags under her eyes. She was wearing the green wool sweater I had bought her for Christmas. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel just like mine had been 20 minutes ago. She looked terrified, but there was a fierce, desperate determination burning in her eyes. She reached forward and adjusted the camera lens. She took a deep, shaky breath and began to speak. Her voice piped through the cheap library headphones, filling my ears and completely shattering my heart. "Thomas," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "If you are watching this video, I am either in federal custody or I am dead. I am so sorry, my love. I am so incredibly sorry for the pain I am putting you through right now. I know you are confused. I know you probably feel completely betrayed. But I need you to listen to me. I need you to listen to every single word I say because your life depends on it." I leaned closer to the monitor, pressing the headphones tighter against my ears. I could not look away from her face. "You think you know my family?" Clara continued, a bitter edge creeping into her tone. "You know that my mother Susan is a snob. You know my brother Bradley is arrogant. But you do not know the monsters they actually are. I never told you because I wanted to protect you from their poison. I wanted our quiet, boring, beautiful life to remain completely untouched. But the truth is, I've been a hostage for 10 years. Clara closed her eyes for a moment as a tear slipped down her cheek. "Before I met you, when I was a junior in college, I made a catastrophic mistake. I was handling the accounting for a large student organization, and a friend of mine stole a massive amount of money. I panicked. I altered the ledger books to cover it up, trying to buy time to fix it. Bradley found out. He did not help me out of brotherly love. He paid off the debt to the university to keep me out of jail, but he kept the forged ledgers. He kept the absolute proof of my felony fraud. He told me that if I ever crossed him, he would send the evidence to the police and ruin my entire life." She opened her eyes and stared directly into the camera lens, looking right into my soul. "When Bradley started his real estate development company 5 years ago, it was entirely legitimate," Clara explained. "But he got greedy. He started taking investment capital from overseas syndicates. He started moving dirty money through his property acquisitions. To do that, he needed a ghost. He needed a legitimate, boring, middle-class accountant who could never run away and never go to the police. He used the college ledgers to blackmail me. He forced me to be his phantom financial officer. Susan knew everything. My own mother helped him set up the offshore shadow accounts. They used me to wash millions of dollars, Thomas." I sat frozen in the hard plastic chair. The library around me completely faded away. Bradley was not a brilliant real estate developer. He was a high-level money launderer. And Susan, the woman who constantly belittled me for my public service salary, was actively facilitating a criminal empire. Clara wiped her face with the sleeve of her green sweater. Her voice dropped to a frantic whisper. 2 years ago, the syndicate demanded a massive infusion of clean cash. Bradley did not have the liquid assets. He panicked. He came to my office and slammed a stack of loan documents on my desk. He forced me to take out a $600,000 home equity line of credit on our house. He forged your signature, Thomas. He had one of his corrupt notary friends stamp the paperwork. When I begged him to stop, when I told him he was destroying our home, he threatened to release the college blackmail and frame you as a co-conspirator. He told me he would destroy your career at the municipal archive and see us both locked in federal prison. I had no choice. I transferred the money to his LLCs to protect you." The air in my lungs rushed out in a heavy, ragged exhale. Clara had not betrayed me. She had not stolen our future to buy herself luxury items. She was a victim trapped in a nightmare, forced to leverage the only sanctuary she had left just to keep me out of a prison cell. The anger that had been burning a hole in my stomach for the last 24 hours instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a profound, crushing sorrow. My wife had been carrying this massive, agonizing burden completely alone. She came home to me every night carrying the weight of a criminal enterprise on her shoulders, and she smiled and asked me about my day. I could not let him win. Clara said, her voice suddenly growing incredibly firm. The fear in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. I could not let Bradley and Susan take everything from us. I knew that eventually Bradley would slip up. I knew the syndicates would demand more money than he could wash, and he would throw me under the bus to save himself, so I fought back. She leaned closer to the camera. 18 months ago, I walked into the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I sat down with an agent in the Financial Crimes Division, and I told them absolutely everything. I gave them the blackmail material Bradley held over me. I gave them everything. They offered me full immunity in exchange for my cooperation. Thomas, for the last year and a half, I have been a highly classified federal informant. My jaw actually dropped. I stared at the computer screen, completely stunned. My quiet, introverted accountant wife was a federal informant. Every night I stayed late at the office, I was not balancing Bradley's books. Clara explained, a fierce, proud smile touching her lips. I was downloading his encrypted servers. I was printing wire transfer logs. I was documenting every single shell company, every single dummy corporation, and every single offshore account Susan managed. I built a bulletproof, airtight RICO case against my own mother and brother. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The FBI has enough evidence to put both of them in federal prison for 20 years. Clara paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. But there is a problem. Bradley is incredibly paranoid. He structured the holding companies so that my name is listed as the primary managing director. Legally speaking, right now, the toxic assets and the fraudulent loans are completely tied to my estate. If I die before the FBI executes the raid, those assets transfer to you as my next of kin. Bradley knows this. He knows that if something happens to me, you will be left holding the bag. He will try to force you to sign relinquishment papers. He will try to use the banking foreclosure to terrify you into signing the LLCs back over to him so he can liquidate them and flee the country. She looked directly into the camera, and I felt like she was sitting right across from me, holding my hands. Listen to me, Thomas. You have to let him think he is winning. You have to play the role he expects you to play. He thinks you are weak. He thinks you are a naive fool who will crumble under the pressure. Let him believe it. Let him force you into his lawyer's office. Let him put those relinquishment papers in front of you. But do not be afraid. Clara reached down below the camera frame and pulled up a thick stack of printed documents. She held them up to the lens. I worked with my FBI handler to draft a very specific federal disclosure, Clara said, her voice ringing with absolute triumph. It is embedded deep inside the relinquishment contract Bradley's lawyers will use. They will never look for it because they are too arrogant to read the fine print of a document they think they control. It is on page 5, Thomas. Page 5 contains a master indemnity clause. It legally binds the signatories to active Department of Justice indictment numbers. If Bradley and Susan sign that relinquishment counterparty line to take the LLCs back from you, they are legally confessing to being the sole active operators of the fraudulent entities. They will be signing their own federal confessions right in front of you. I sat in the library, completely paralyzed by the sheer brilliance of what my wife had engineered. She had anticipated Bradley's exact moves. She knew he would come for me at the funeral. She knew he would lock me out of my house. She had set a financial bear trap so perfectly disguised that her arrogant brother was going to walk right into it, begging to snap it shut on his own leg. Clara lowered the papers. Her fierce expression softened, melting back into the loving, gentle woman I had married 8 years ago. Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled over her eyelashes. I am so tired, Thomas. she whispered, her voice breaking completely. I am so incredibly tired of fighting them. I know they suspect something. Bradley has been watching me closely. I recorded this video tonight because I am terrified I might not make it to the end of the week. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that I never stopped loving you, not for a single second. She reached a trembling hand toward the camera lens as if she was trying to touch my face through the digital screen. You were my safe place, Thomas. You were the only pure, honest thing in my entire life. Your boring municipal job, your silly history books, the way you make cheap coffee in the morning. It was my sanctuary. I built this trap to protect you. I built this trap so that when the dust finally settles, you will be entirely free from them. Do not let them break your spirit. Walk into that room, sign the papers, and make them read page 5. I love you, Thomas. I will always love you. The video feed cut to black. I sat in the cold library staring at my own dark reflection in the monitor. The silence in my head was absolute. The overwhelming, paralyzing grief that had been drowning me for the last 3 days was suddenly gone. The terrifying fear of being homeless, the panic of the frozen bank accounts, the shame of being fired from my job, it all completely evaporated. My wife did not die a traitor. My wife died a warrior. She spent the last 2 years of her life walking through a literal hell, smiling at the monsters who held her captive, all while quietly, meticulously building the very cage that was going to destroy them. She sacrificed everything to ensure that I would survive. I reached up and pulled the cheap library headphones off my ears. I unplugged the micro USB drive and gripped it tightly in my fist. I did not feel like a broken, helpless widower anymore. I did not feel like a stray dog begging for scraps. I felt an incredible surging wave of absolute clarity and purpose coursing through my veins. Bradley wanted a victim. Bradley wanted a desperate, starving man to walk into his penthouse law firm and sign his life away for a few $1,000s. He wanted me to grovel. I stood up from the computer terminal, pushing the hard plastic chair back. I wiped the remaining tears from my face and smoothed down the lapels of my ruined, damp suit. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of the computer screen. I had exactly 24 hours before my meeting at the law firm. I had 24 hours to prepare for the absolute greatest performance of my entire life. I was going to walk into that lion's den wearing this exact same muddy suit. I was going to tremble. I was going to beg. I was going to let Bradley and Susan gorge themselves on my humiliation. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted right up until the very second they put their expensive pens to the paper. Clara had laid the trap. Now it was my turn to spring it. I walked out of the library and stepped back into the freezing rain, ready to burn their empire to the ground. The video continued to play on the library computer monitor, holding my complete and absolute attention. Clara shifted in the driver's seat of her car, her green wool sweater catching the dim light of the parking garage. The fear that had been so prominent in her eyes just moments ago had completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that I had never seen in the 8 years we were married. This was not my quiet accountant wife. This was a woman who had spent 2 years playing chess with the federal government and a criminal syndicate. I need you to understand exactly what Bradley shoved into your hands at the cemetery, Clara said, her voice echoing clearly through the cheap plastic headphones. Bradley thinks he is a mastermind. He thinks he can manipulate the legal system just like he manipulates our mother, but he is a fool who relies entirely on the paperwork I drafted for his company. The documents he wants you to sign are not standard probate releases. They are a highly specific trap I spent 6 months building with my handlers at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I leaned closer to the screen, completely captivated. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Bradley operates 5 primary holding companies. Clara explained, her tone strictly professional now. Those are the LLCs that own the commercial real estate properties downtown. But those properties are just a front. The real purpose of those LLCs is to wash millions of dollars in illicit cash for overseas investors. For the last 2 years, I have fed every single wire transfer, every single routing number, and every single fake invoice directly to the Department of Justice. The FBI has been monitoring those accounts around the clock. They are actively building a massive racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations case. A RICO case. Thomas, the kind of case that brings down entire crime families. She paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. Because the federal government is watching those specific holding companies. They are completely radioactive, Clara continued. Anyone whose name is legally attached to those LLCs when the indictments come down is going to federal prison. Bradley knows the authorities are starting to circle. He feels the pressure from his overseas partners. He is terrified. That is why he forced me to take out the $600,000 home equity line of credit on our house. He needed a massive injection of clean cash to cover a shortfall before the syndicate sent people to hurt him. I had to forge your signature, Thomas. I had to do it to keep you off his radar. If I had refused, he would have destroyed you. Tears welled up in my eyes again, but this time they were not tears of betrayal. They were tears of absolute awe. My wife had ruined my credit and stolen our home to save my life. She had taken all the danger entirely upon herself. But my death changes his entire timeline, Clara said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Because I am legally listed as the primary managing director of those shell companies, my sudden death triggers an automatic chain of custody transfer. As my husband, you are my sole legal heir. That means the absolute second my heart stopped beating, you became the legal owner of 5 radioactive money laundering corporations. I grabbed the edge of the computer desk. The sheer reality of what she was saying hit me like a freight train. I was currently the head of a criminal empire. Bradley is in a state of sheer absolute panic right now, Clara said, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. He cannot access the funds in those LLCs because the bank requires the primary director to authorize the transfers. He needs to sever you from the chain of custody before the accounts lock permanently in probate. That is why he ambushed you at the funeral. That is why he is freezing your personal accounts and letting the bank lock you out of our home. He is applying maximum financial pressure to break your spirit. He needs you to sign those relinquishment papers so he can legally reclaim ownership of the LLCs, liquidate the assets, and flee the country before the FBI closes in. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the situation. Bradley thought he was playing a brilliant game of intimidation. He thought he was putting a boot on the neck of a weak municipal archivist. He had no idea that his dead sister had already orchestrated his complete destruction. If you hold on to those companies, Thomas, you will be caught in the federal net. Clara warned, her expression turning deadly serious. If you do not sign the papers, the bank will eventually seize everything, and the FBI will have to drag you into an interrogation room just to figure out what happened. You cannot fight this from the outside. You have to give Bradley exactly what he wants. You have to sign the relinquishment. I stared at the screen, completely bewildered. Why would she want me to hand the companies back to him if it meant he could escape? Because of page 5, Clara said, answering my silent question. Her eyes burned with a fierce, triumphant light. Bradley pays his corporate lawyers thousands of dollars an hour. But they are lazy, Clara explained. They do not draft new contracts from scratch. They use the digital boilerplate templates stored on the company server. I am the one who manages that server. 3 weeks ago, I uploaded a new master template for estate relinquishment. I knew that if something happened to me, his lawyers would simply print that document, change the names, and hand it to you. She leaned so close to the camera I could see the exhausted lines around her eyes. On page 5 of that document, I embedded a master indemnity clause, Clara whispered. It is buried under layers of dense legal jargon about tax liabilities and corporate restructuring. But legally, it is an absolute death sentence. The clause explicitly states that by signing the counterparty line, the recipient assumes 100% of all past, present, and future criminal liability associated with the holding companies. It legally binds the signatories to assume responsibility for the fraudulent debt on our house. But more importantly, it lists the exact active Department of Justice indictment numbers my FBI handlers are using for the RICO case. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a cold chill wash down my spine. The brilliance of the trap was absolutely terrifying. When you sign the relinquishment, you are legally walking away from the toxic assets. Clara said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. But when Bradley and my mother sign the counterparty lines to accept the transfer, they are not just taking the LLCs back. They are signing a legally binding confession to massive federal crimes. They are putting their own ink on a document that acknowledges the federal indictments and admits sole active ownership of the fraud. Once their signatures are on page 5, the FBI has the immediate legal authorization to raid the building and make the arrests. She reached up and wiped a stray tear from her cheek. But they will not sign it if they suspect anything is wrong, Thomas. Bradley is a predator. If he senses that you are confident, if he senses that you know something, he will have his lawyers read every single word of that contract. You cannot let that happen. Clara looked directly at me, her expression hardening into absolute resolve. You have to make them beg for it, Thomas. You have to make them think they are stealing everything from you. When you walk into that law office tomorrow, you have to be the exact pathetic loser they have always believed you are. You have to let them humiliate you. You have to beg for your house back. You have to ask for money. You have to tremble. Her words were painful to hear, but I knew she was completely right. My entire survival depended on my ability to swallow my pride and play the role of the victim. Let Susan insult you, Clara commanded. Let Bradley offer you a pathetic cash buyout. Make them feel so incredibly superior to you that they become blinded by their own arrogance. People like my mother and my brother only care about winning. If they think they are destroying you, they will be so eager to finalize your defeat that they will sign the papers without reading the fine print. You have to give them the greatest performance of your life. She paused, taking one final deep breath. The fierce warrior faded away, leaving only the woman I had loved for 8 years. I am so sorry I cannot be there to hold your hand through this, Thomas. I am so sorry for the cold nights and the empty bank accounts. But when this is over, you will be safe. You will be free. I love you more than words can say. Now go finish this. The video feed snapped to black. The small computer screen showed only my reflection. I sat in the quiet library for a long time. The faint sound of pages turning and chairs scraping against the linoleum floor seemed to come from a different universe. I reached forward and slowly pulled the micro USB drive out of the computer tower. I held it tightly in my fist, feeling the sharp metal edges digging into my skin. I had walked into this library as a broken, completely defeated man. I had spent the night freezing in my car, believing my entire life was a lie. I had believed I was completely powerless against the immense wealth and cruelty of my wife's family. But as I stood up from the computer chair, I realized that true power did not look like a custom Tom Ford suit. True power did not look like a fleet of luxury SUVs parked at a cemetery. True power was a quiet, exhausted accountant who systematically dismantled an entire criminal syndicate from the inside out just to protect the man she loved. I walked out of the library and stepped back out onto the street. The freezing rain was still falling heavily, washing the grime and exhaust off the city sidewalks. The wind was still biting through the thin fabric of my suit jacket. But I did not feel the cold anymore. The agonizing hunger in my stomach had been completely replaced by a hot, burning anticipation. I walked the 3 blocks back to the municipal parking lot. I climbed into my beat-up Honda Civic and started the engine. I did not look at the broken snow globe scattered across the floor mats. I did not look at the leather journal in the back seat. I put the car in gear and drove out into the city traffic. I had 24 hours until my meeting at the downtown penthouse law firm. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I drove to a rundown gas station on the edge of the commercial district. I parked the car by the side of the building and walked into the public restroom. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered aggressively, buzzing with a loud, annoying hum. The room smelled like cheap industrial soap and old stale cigarettes. It was the perfect place for a man at the absolute bottom of his life. I walked over to the cracked mirror hanging above the stained porcelain sink. I turned the handle, letting the freezing tap water run over my hands. I cupped my palms and splashed the icy water over my face. I scrubbed the dirt and exhaustion from my skin, letting the water drip down my neck and soak into the collar of my dress shirt. I gripped the edges of the sink and stared at my reflection in the dirty mirror. I looked terrible. My eyes were bloodshot and swollen from days of crying. My skin was incredibly pale, highlighting the dark purple bruises of exhaustion under my eyes. My hair was unkempt and damp, falling awkwardly across my forehead. My suit was deeply wrinkled, stained with mud from the cemetery and stiff from drying in the cold car. I looked like a man who had lost absolutely everything. I looked like a man who had been completely crushed by the weight of a hostile world. I looked exactly like the pathetic, weak municipal archivist that Bradley and Susan so desperately wanted me to be. I practiced a trembling breath. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my posture. I practiced looking down at the floor, avoiding direct eye contact. I imagined Bradley sitting across a mahogany table, pushing a stack of $100 bills toward me, telling me I was a failure. I practiced letting my lower lip quiver. It was terrifyingly easy to slip into the role because just an hour ago that role had been my actual reality. But now the fear was completely gone. Behind the bloodshot eyes and the slumped shoulders, a quiet, calculated fire was burning. I reached into my pocket and felt the outline of the tiny silver flash drive. Clara had given me the weapon. She had laid the trap perfectly. All I had to do was walk into the lion's den and convince the lions that I was nothing more than an easy meal. I turned the water off. The loud squeak of the rusted plumbing echoed in the small bathroom. I wiped my wet face with a rough paper towel and tossed it into the overflowing trash can. I took one final look in the mirror, locking eyes with the broken, defeated man staring back at me. "Make them beg for it," I whispered out loud, repeating Clara's final instruction. "Make them think they are stealing everything from you." I pushed the heavy metal door of the restroom open and walked back out into the pouring rain. I got into my freezing car and prepared myself for the performance of my life. The illusion of my pathetic surrender was about to destroy them all. The towering glass and steel skyscraper of Bradley's corporate law firm loomed over the downtown streets like a massive monument to raw, unadulterated greed. I parked my battered 10-year-old Honda Civic in a metered space 2 blocks away. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, letting the engine idle while I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked absolutely destroyed. My cheap suit was a wrinkled, stiff mess from drying directly on my body after the freezing rain at the cemetery. My dress shirt was stained with sweat and dirt. I had not shaved. The dark circles under my bloodshot eyes made me look hollowed out and completely desperate. I looked exactly like a man who had lost his wife, his home, and his entire future in a single weekend. I turned off the engine. It was time to give the performance of my life. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the high-rise building and stepped into a lobby that screamed of overwhelming wealth. The floors were polished white marble. The security desk was carved from a single block of dark granite. The uniformed security guard took one look at my muddy shoes and my rumpled suit and immediately stood up ready to throw me back out onto the street. I walked straight up to him, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped, playing the role of the defeated loser to absolute perfection. I told him my name and said I was there to see the legal team on the top floor. The guard made a quick phone call, his eyes scanning my ruined clothes with obvious disgust. He printed a temporary visitor badge and pointed me toward the private executive elevators. The elevator ride to the penthouse took less than 60 seconds, but my heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs the entire way up. I had to keep reminding myself of Clara's video. I had to keep hearing her voice in my head. "Make them beg for it, Thomas. Make them think they are stealing everything from you." I let out a long, shaky breath. I let the genuine grief of losing my wife push a fresh wave of hot tears into my eyes. I let my hands tremble. By the time the silver elevator doors slid open, I was the very picture of a broken, pathetic man. I stepped out of the elevator and into a reception area that looked like a modern art museum. A young receptionist in a tailored suit directed me down a long, quiet hallway toward the main executive boardroom. I walked slowly, dragging my feet, letting my muddy shoes leave faint, dirty scuff marks on the pristine, cream-colored carpet. I pushed open the heavy double-glass doors of the boardroom and walked into the lion's den. The room was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the entire city skyline. In the center of the room sat a gigantic, polished mahogany conference table, surrounded by black leather chairs. Bradley and Susan were already there. They were sitting at the far end of the table looking like royalty holding court. Bradley wore a razor-sharp navy blue bespoke suit with a silk tie. Susan was draped in an expensive cashmere sweater, her blonde hair perfectly styled. They were both sipping espresso from delicate porcelain cups. They looked so incredibly comfortable, so perfectly at ease, while my entire world had been completely dismantled. Sitting next to them was a man I did not recognize. He was older, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a gray suit that probably cost more than my car. He had the cold, predatory look of a high-powered corporate lawyer who spent his entire career crushing normal people for sport. I stood frozen just inside the doorway. I intentionally let my hands shake where they could see them. I kept my gaze lowered, looking at the polished grain of the mahogany table instead of looking them in the eye. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Susan said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated knife. She set her espresso cup down on a silver saucer with a sharp clink. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a vicious sneer of absolute contempt. "Look at you. You track mud into a multi-million-dollar law firm wearing a suit that looks like it was pulled out of a garbage can." Clara always did have a terrible habit of picking up stray dogs. I forced myself to flinch. I let the insult hit me visibly, letting my shoulders drop even further. I bit the inside of my cheek, using the physical pain to force more tears into my eyes. I did not say a word. I just stood there looking entirely helpless. Bradley laughed. It was that same cold, arrogant laugh I had heard at the cemetery. "Have a seat, Thomas," he commanded, pointing to a leather chair at the opposite end of the massive table. "Do not stand there dripping on the floor. We have business to conclude, and my time is incredibly valuable today." I walked slowly to the chair and sat down. The leather was soft and expensive, a sharp contrast to the damp, stiff fabric of my ruined suit. I rested my trembling hands on the surface of the table. The silver-haired lawyer cleared his throat and fixed his cold gaze on me. "Mr. Thomas," he began, his voice smooth and incredibly condescending. "My name is Mr. Sterling. I represent your brother-in-law and the associated corporate holdings of his real estate development firm. As I am sure you are aware, your late wife was the primary managing director of several limited liability companies. Due to her sudden and unfortunate passing, those corporate assets are currently in a state of legal limbo. Furthermore, there is the matter of a $600,000 debt cross, collateralized against your primary residence." Mr. Sterling reached out and placed a massive document on the table. It was easily 50 pages long, bound with a thick black legal clip. He pushed it across the smooth mahogany surface. It slid perfectly, stopping right in front of my trembling hands. "This is a comprehensive estate relinquishment agreement," Mr. Sterling continued, tapping his expensive gold pen against the table. "By signing this document, you completely renounce any and all claims to the corporate entities managed by your late wife. You will execute a full legal transfer of executive authority back to my client. In exchange, my client has generously agreed to provide you with a modest cash severance to assist you in relocating and starting over." I stared down at the thick stack of paper. The front page was filled with dense, intimidating legal jargon. I knew exactly what this document was. I knew that buried on page 5 was the master indemnity clause Clara had secretly drafted with her federal handlers. I knew that this stack of paper was a loaded gun waiting to go off, but I had to play my part. I reached out with a shaking hand and slowly turned the first page. I pretended to read the legal text, letting my eyes dart back and forth in simulated confusion. I let out a soft, desperate gasp. "I do not understand all of this," I stammered, my voice cracking pitifully. "I am just an archivist. I do not know anything about corporate transfers or holding companies. Clara handled all of our paperwork. You want me to sign away my legal rights, but the bank already locked me out of my house." Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with an expression of pure, overwhelming superiority. "I told you what would happen, Thomas. I warned you at the cemetery. You thought you could stand out in the rain and play the proud husband. But pride does not pay the bills, does it? Pride does not put a roof over your head when the commercial lending department puts a steel padlock on your front door." "Please," I begged, looking up at Bradley with wide, terrified eyes. I let a single tear spill over my eyelid and run down my cheek. "Please, Bradley. The debt collectors called my office yesterday. They tied up the entire city switchboard. Human Resources called me in and fired me. They placed me on indefinite unpaid leave. I lost my job. I slept in my car last night. It was freezing. I do not have a single dollar to my name. My checking account is completely empty." Susan rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, spare us the tragic sob story," she muttered. "We do not care that you lost your little public service job. We do not care that you slept in a Honda. You brought this entirely upon yourself by refusing to cooperate." I turned my desperate gaze back to Bradley. I gripped the edges of the 50-page relinquishment document. "Bradley, you said you would give me $10,000 to walk away. You said you would give me cash to start over in a new state." "That is correct," Bradley said, a smug smile spreading across his face. $10,000. You sign the paper, you hand over the companies, and you walk out of this building with a briefcase full of cash. It is more money than you deserve, but I am willing to pay it just to permanently scrub you from our family history. I swallowed hard, intentionally making my throat click. I forced my hands to shake even harder, rattling the heavy paper against the mahogany table. $10,000 is not enough, I whispered, pleading with him. "Bradley, please. I have nothing. I cannot even afford the gas to drive out of the state. I need to put down a security deposit on a new apartment. I need to buy food. $10,000 will disappear in a month. Please. Just give me $20,000. $20,000 is absolutely nothing to you. You wear suits that cost $10,000. Please just give me $20,000 and I will sign whatever you want. I will disappear forever. I swear to you." The boardroom went completely silent. Mr. Sterling looked at Bradley, waiting for his client to respond. Susan scoffed, picking up her espresso cup and looking out the window, completely entirely bored by my pathetic begging. Bradley stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the mud flaking off my shoes onto the carpet. He looked at my uncombed hair and the dark, terrified circles under my eyes. He was drinking in my absolute humiliation. He was savoring every single second of my total defeat. Suddenly, Bradley threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming, cruel laugh that bounced off the glass walls of the penthouse boardroom. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. $20,000, he mocked, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. You really are a pathetic little man, Thomas. You sit there in your ruined clothes, smelling like a wet dog, and you actually think you are in a position to negotiate with me. You actually think you have any leverage left in this room. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. His smile vanished, replaced by the aggressive, predatory glare of a man accustomed to crushing his enemies into dust. You do not get to negotiate, Bradley hissed, his voice echoing with raw authority. You do not get to ask for a single penny more. You are a complete failure. My sister used you as a blind shield for 8 years because she knew you were too stupid and too weak to ever ask questions. You are entirely disposable to us. Bradley reached down to the floor beside his leather chair. He lifted a sleek black leather briefcase and slammed it heavily onto the center of the mahogany table. The sudden loud noise made me physically jump backward in my chair. He reached out and popped the 2 gold latches. The briefcase sprang open. Inside the black velvet interior lay 10 neat bundles of $100 bills, exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash. "Look at it," Bradley commanded, pointing a sharp finger at the open briefcase. "That is your entire worth, Thomas. That is the exact absolute value of your existence. You either take this money right now and sign those papers, or Mr. Sterling makes a phone call to his friends at the federal prosecutor's office. You will be arrested for a $600,000 bank fraud before you even make it back down to the lobby. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison cell." Susan turned back from the window, a cruel, victorious smile lighting up her face. "Take the money, you little parasite," she hissed. "Take the money and get out of our sight." I looked at the stacks of cash. I looked at the 50-page document sitting in front of my trembling hands. I looked at the arrogant, smug faces of the people who had treated me like garbage for 8 years. They were absolutely convinced they had won. They were so blinded by their own superiority and my pathetic performance that they had completely dropped their guard. They thought they were backing a terrified animal into a corner. They had no idea they were walking directly into a federal trap. "Take the scraps," Thomas Bradley sneered, pushing the silver pen across the table until it touched my fingertips. "Take the scraps and sign your name." I slowly reached out. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped the heavy silver pen. I wrapped my fingers around the cool metal. I pulled the massive relinquishment document toward my chest, acting like a man signing away his very soul. I lowered my head, hiding the tiny cold smile that was fighting its way onto my lips. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line on the very first page. I was ready. Everything Clara had planned was about to happen. The final curtain was about to drop on their entire criminal empire. I took a deep breath and began to sign my name. The heavy silver pen felt incredibly cold against my sweating palm. I kept my head down, staring at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the mahogany table. I forced my hand to shake violently. I made sure Bradley and Susan could see the pathetic tremor in my fingers. I wanted them to completely believe that they were breaking me. I wanted them to feel the absolute rush of their own superiority. I pressed the tip of the pen against the first signature line. The ink bled slightly into the paper. I signed my full name on the first page. Mr. Sterling. The high-powered corporate lawyer reached over and flipped to the next page, indicating another signature line with his manicured finger. I signed that one too. I moved methodically through the 50-page document. I signed away my rights to Horizon Holdings. I signed away my legal connection to Crestview Property Development. I signed away my claim to Vanguard Regional Management. With every single stroke of the silver pen, I was legally amputating myself from the toxic, radioactive assets that Clara had tied to my name. I was stepping entirely out of the blast zone. Bradley watched me with absolute sheer delight. He leaned forward in his expensive leather chair, his eyes tracking the movement of my pen. He was literally salivating over the paperwork. He thought he was watching a starving homeless man surrender an entire criminal empire for a briefcase full of pocket change. He thought he was getting away with everything. Susan let out a soft, elegant sigh of relief. She picked up her espresso cup and took a slow, confident sip. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, completely satisfied. She believed the crisis was over. She believed the dirty money was safe and that I would be scrubbing toilets in another state by tomorrow morning. I reached the final page of the relinquishment section. I signed my name one last time. I let the silver pen slip from my fingers, letting it clatter loudly against the polished wood of the table. I let out a long, pathetic breath. I pushed the massive stack of papers across the table toward Mr. Sterling. "It is done," I whispered, keeping my voice weak and defeated. "I signed everything you asked me to sign. I do not own the companies anymore. They are yours. Now please just give me the money so I can leave." Bradley did not even look at the briefcase full of cash. He lunged forward and snatched the documents away from Mr. Sterling. He pulled the thick stack of paper directly in front of him. His eyes were wide with greedy, frantic energy. He grabbed his own solid gold pen from the inside pocket of his custom navy blue suit. "You are an absolute fool," Thomas Bradley said, his voice shaking with pure adrenaline. "You always were a blind, pathetic fool. You just gave me back the keys to the kingdom." Bradley flipped rapidly to the back of the contract. He bypassed the dense paragraphs of legal text, completely ignoring the fine print. He was too arrogant to read the details. He was too desperate to reclaim his stolen power. He found the counterparty execution lines. These were the lines that legally finalized the transfer. By signing these lines, he was officially accepting ownership of the limited liability companies. He pressed his gold pen to the paper and signed his name with a violent, aggressive flourish. He signed the second line. He signed the third line. He was practically panting with excitement. He slid the document over to his mother. Susan set her espresso cup down. She picked up the pen and looked at me with a cold, triumphant smirk. "You can take your $10,000 and crawl back into whatever hole you came from," Susan said, her voice dripping with venom. "Do not ever show your face in this city again. You are nothing to this family. You never were." Susan signed her name gracefully on the final witness line. She capped the gold pen and pushed the document back to Mr. Sterling. The lawyer picked up his own notary stamp. He pressed it firmly onto the paper, sealing the legal transaction. The transfer was officially complete. The toxic assets, the fraudulent debt, and the entire money laundering operation were now legally and undeniably back in their hands. Bradley let out a massive breath of relief. He slumped back into his leather chair, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at the black leather briefcase sitting in the center of the table. He flicked his wrist, gesturing toward it. "Take the cash and get out of my building," Bradley commanded. "The meeting is over." I sat perfectly still. I did not reach for the briefcase. I did not look at the money. The performance was over. The pathetic, trembling victim died right there in that expensive leather chair. I let my shoulders pull back. I straightened my spine. I lifted my chin and looked directly across the massive mahogany table. I locked my eyes onto Bradley. The terrified, bloodshot gaze was completely gone. I stared at him with the cold, calculating intensity of a man who had just orchestrated a masterpiece. I did not touch the money. I did not move a single muscle. I just sat there staring at him until the heavy silence in the boardroom became uncomfortable. Bradley frowned. His arrogant smile faltered slightly. He shifted in his chair, suddenly unnerved by the drastic sudden change in my posture. "I told you to take the money and leave, Thomas," he repeated, his voice losing a fraction of its absolute certainty. I folded my hands, resting them calmly on the polished wood. "I am not taking your money, Bradley," I said. My voice was steady, deep, and perfectly clear. It did not crack. It did not tremble. "I am not leaving this city. I am not going anywhere." Susan narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, leaning forward. "We have the signatures. We have the companies. You have absolutely nothing. Grab the briefcase and get out before we have security drag you out by your cheap collar." I ignored her completely. I kept my eyes locked on Bradley. I watched the first tiny seed of doubt plant itself directly behind his eyes. He looked down at the contract, then back up at me. He could sense that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room, but his massive ego prevented him from seeing the trap. "Did you read page 5? I asked. The words dropped into the quiet boardroom like a physical bomb. Bradley blinked. The confusion on his face was absolute. What he asked, his brow furrowing. I leaned forward slightly, mirroring his earlier aggression. I said, "Did you read page 5, Bradley? Did you or your highly paid corporate lawyer bother to read the fine print of the legal document you just signed your entire life away on?" Bradley turned his head slowly, looking at Mr. Sterling. The older lawyer had suddenly gone completely rigid. The color began to drain rapidly from his face. Mr. Sterling reached out with a slightly trembling hand and pulled the thick legal document back toward him. He flipped the pages back. Page 10, page 8, page 6. He stopped on page 5. Mr. Sterling pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He leaned over the document. His eyes began to scan the dense paragraphs of text. The silence in the room stretched out agonizingly. I watched the exact moment the corporate lawyer realized he had just helped his clients walk directly into a federal slaughterhouse. Mr. Sterling let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke. His hands began to shake violently, rattling the heavy paper against the table. The smug, predatory lawyer was suddenly sweating profusely. "What is it?" Bradley demanded, leaning over the table. "What does page 5 say, Sterling? Tell me what it says right now." Mr. Sterling could barely speak. He looked up at Bradley, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "Bradley," he whispered, his tone completely devoid of its previous arrogant polish. "Bradley, this is a master indemnity clause. This is not a standard probate release. This is a federal disclosure template. Read it." I commanded, my voice echoing loudly in the massive room. "Read it out loud for them, Mr. Sterling. Read them exactly what they just signed." Mr. Sterling looked at me with absolute horror. He looked back down at the paper. His voice shook uncontrollably as he began to read the dense legal text aloud. "By signing the counterparty execution line, the signatories explicitly and voluntarily assume 100% of all past, present, and future criminal liability associated with the aforementioned corporate entities." Mr. Sterling read the sweat beading on his forehead. "The signatories acknowledge total active ownership of the fraudulent debt structured under the primary collateral property." Susan let out a sharp, confused breath. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. "What is he talking about, Bradley?" "Keep reading," I said, never breaking eye contact with Bradley. "Read the rest of it." Mr. Sterling wiped his mouth. "Furthermore, the signatories legally bind themselves to the active federal investigations associated with these entities. The signatories formally acknowledge their status as the sole operators of the money laundering channels listed under the following Department of Justice indictment numbers." Mr. Sterling stopped reading. He dropped the document onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. He pushed his chair back, trying to physically distance himself from the toxic paperwork. Bradley stared at the lawyer, his face turning an awful shade of pale gray. "Department of Justice." He repeated the words, barely escaping his lips. "Indictment numbers." "What indictment numbers?" "Sterling, what did I just sign?" "You just signed a full legal confession, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely merciless. "You just legally admitted to being the sole active operator of a massive federal money laundering syndicate. You just assumed total criminal responsibility for the fraudulent home equity line of credit you forced my wife to take out. You just put your name and your mother's name on a binding federal document acknowledging active federal indictments." Bradley shot out of his chair. The heavy leather seat tipped over backward and crashed loudly onto the carpet. He lunged across the mahogany table, his hands desperately clawing for the stack of papers. He was making a frantic, panicked noise in the back of his throat. He wanted to tear the document to shreds. He wanted to destroy the signatures before the ink could dry. He never got the chance. Before Bradley could tear a single page, the heavy double glass doors of the penthouse boardroom absolutely exploded inward. The sound was deafening. It sounded like a bomb detonating in the quiet corporate hallway. Federal agents flooded into the room. There were at least a dozen of them. They wore heavy tactical gear, dark body armor, and windbreakers with large yellow letters printed across the back. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. The pristine, quiet atmosphere of the multi-million-dollar law firm was instantly shattered by the chaotic shouting of federal law enforcement. "Federal agents, stay exactly where you are." A massive man in tactical gear roared, pointing a weapon directly at Bradley. "Drop the document. Drop it right now and put your hands where I can see them." Bradley froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden overwhelming display of force. The legal document slipped from his trembling hands and scattered across the polished mahogany table. He raised his hands into the air, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking incredibly ridiculous against the tactical armor of the arresting agents. Susan screamed a high-pitched, piercing sound of total disbelief. She jumped up from her chair, knocking her delicate espresso cup over. The dark liquid spilled across the table, soaking into the carpet. 2 female agents instantly flanked her. They grabbed her arms, pulling them forcefully behind her back. "Get your hands off me!" Susan shrieked, struggling against the agents. "Do you know who I am? I am a respectable woman. You cannot do this to me." "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud," the agent stated calmly, snapping heavy steel handcuffs securely over Susan's expensive designer sleeves. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." 2 massive agents grabbed Bradley. They slammed him face first into the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The impact rattled the pane. Bradley grunted in pain, his face pressed awkwardly against the cold glass while he watched his entire empire completely collapse. The agents pulled his arms behind his back and locked the handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the steel cuffs echoed loudly over the shouting. Mr. Sterling, the arrogant, high-powered lawyer, had backed himself entirely into the corner of the boardroom. He had his hands raised in the air, sweating profusely, repeating over and over that he was just outside legal counsel and had absolutely no knowledge of the criminal enterprise. The agents ignored him, securing the signed relinquishment document into a clear plastic evidence bag. I remained seated in my leather chair. I did not move. I did not flinch when the doors burst open. I simply sat there in my ruined, cheap suit, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to erase me. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, walked over to the table. She looked down at the evidence bag containing the contract. She verified the fresh signatures on page 5. She looked up at me and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of deep respect. Clara's handler. She had been waiting in the stairwell, monitoring the audio feed, watching the trap spring perfectly shut. Bradley was violently yanked away from the glass window. The agents began to march him toward the boardroom doors. As they dragged him past the table, he fought against their grip, turning his head to look at me. His face was red, his eyes wide with a mixture of pure hatred and total disbelief. "How did you do this?" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking in sheer desperation. "You are nothing. You are a nobody. How did you do this to me?" I stood up slowly from my chair. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table, stepping over the spilled espresso. I stopped right in front of Bradley, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. "I did not do this to you, Bradley," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Clara did this to you. She spent 2 years building this cage around you, while you thought she was just your obedient little ghost. She was 10 times smarter than you will ever be. She left me the key to the cage, and you were so blinded by your own arrogant greed that you practically begged me to lock you inside it." Bradley stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The realization completely shattered him. The knowledge that his quiet, unassuming sister had outsmarted him, that she had orchestrated his total ruin from beyond the grave, finally broke his mind. He let his head drop in absolute defeat. The agents dragged him out of the room. Susan followed closely behind, her screams echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors finally closed, cutting off the sound completely. I stood alone in the center of the massive wrecked boardroom. The tactical agents secured the remaining files and began to process the crime scene. The storm outside had finally broken, letting a thin ray of morning sunlight pierce through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with clean air. The heavy, crushing weight I had carried since the funeral was entirely gone. The pathetic, weak man they thought I was had vanished forever. Clara had given me back my life, and I had just delivered her final absolute justice. I walked down the quiet hallway of the law firm, feeling the thick carpet under my shoes. The corporate staff was pressed against the walls, watching the raid in sheer stunned silence. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. I did not stop to explain anything to them. I walked straight to the executive elevator and pressed the call button. The silver doors slid open instantly, welcoming me inside. As the elevator descended rapidly toward the ground floor, I leaned against the back wall and closed my eyes. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins for the last 24 hours slowly began to fade, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. I thought about the manila envelope at the cemetery. I thought about the broken snow globe in my car. I thought about Clara sitting in that dark parking garage recording her final message to me. She had been so incredibly brave. She had faced down a massive criminal organization to ensure that I would survive the fallout. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming surge of love for her. The elevator chimed a soft bell and the doors opened into the marble lobby. The security guard, who had looked at me with disgust earlier, was staring at the floor, completely terrified. I walked confidently across the polished marble, pushing through the heavy glass doors and stepping out onto the street. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the city looking washed clean and strangely bright. I reached into my pocket and touched my car keys. I knew the road ahead was still going to require massive amounts of work, but the paralyzing fear was permanently dead. I was completely free. I had survived the absolute worst day of my life and executed a brilliant masterstroke of justice. I walked toward my car, ready to finally go home. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stood on the wet concrete of the downtown sidewalk. The chaotic symphony of police sirens echoed off the surrounding buildings. I watched as a fleet of black federal vehicles and local police cruisers completely surrounded the entrance of the law firm. Pedestrians were stopping on the street, pulling out their phones to record the massive spectacle. I stood across the street, leaning against a damp brick wall, and watched the final act of Bradley's arrogant life unfold right in front of me. 2 heavy wooden doors swung open, and the tactical agents marched Bradley out into the cold morning air. His custom-tailored navy blue suit was wrinkled and stained. His hands were bound tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He looked absolutely terrified. The smug, invincible real estate developer was gone, completely replaced by a pathetic, trembling criminal who finally realized he was entirely outmatched. Susan was brought out next. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming at the officers that her designer clothes were getting ruined. She looked wildly around the crowd, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She spotted me standing across the street. For one brief second, our eyes met. She did not look at me with disgust or contempt anymore. She looked at me with absolute sheer terror. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just turned my back on them and walked away. The nightmare was officially over. The next 3 weeks felt like waking up from a long, suffocating fever dream. The news of the massive federal raid dominated the local and national television headlines. The media detailed exactly how a high-profile real estate syndicate had been laundering tens of millions of dollars for overseas criminals. Bradley and Susan were splashed across the screen, stripped of their wealth and their fake respectability. They were completely denied bail. The federal prosecutors labeled them an extreme flight risk. They were both sitting in a concrete federal detention center, looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The immediate financial relief for me was absolute, because the federal agents had officially seized the holding companies and all associated assets. They also intercepted the fraudulent debts. The Department of Justice issued a direct federal mandate to the commercial bank that had locked me out of my home. The mandate officially declared the $600,000 home equity line of credit a completely fraudulent transaction executed under severe criminal duress. The bank was forced to immediately nullify the entire debt. They removed the steel padlock from my front door. They unfroze my modest joint checking and savings accounts. I moved back into my quiet suburban house. I slept in my own bed for the first time in almost a month. I thought that simply getting my normal life back was the ultimate victory. I thought Clara had given me the greatest gift possible just by clearing my name and saving our home. I had absolutely no idea that she was not finished taking care of me. On a quiet Tuesday morning, my cell phone rang. It was not a debt collector or a predatory lawyer. It was a secure line from the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The voice on the other end belonged to Special Agent Miller. She was the tall woman with the sharp, intelligent eyes who had supervised the raid in the boardroom. She was Clara's handler. She asked me to come down to the federal building for a final debriefing regarding the closure of the asset seizure. I put on a clean-pressed suit, drove my beat-up Honda Civic downtown, and walked through the heavy security checkpoints of the Federal Plaza. Agent Miller was waiting for me in a sterile, brightly lit conference room. The walls were completely bare and the table was simple gray metal. It was the exact opposite of the luxurious mahogany boardroom where Bradley had tried to end my life. Agent Miller stood up and shook my hand firmly, offering me a seat across from her. She pushed a thick white folder across the metal table. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm and filled with a profound respect. "I wanted to meet with you personally today to finalize the last components of your wife's operation. Clara was one of the most brilliant and courageous informants I have ever worked with in my entire career with the Bureau. She walked into incredibly dangerous rooms every single day, knowing that one wrong move could cost her everything. She did it entirely to protect you." I nodded, looking down at the white folder. I know I said, my voice thick with emotion. I saw the video she left for me. She saved my life. I have my house back. I have my name cleared. I do not know how to ever repay her for that. Agent Miller offered a soft, knowing smile. "She saved your life, Thomas, but she also did something else. Clara did not just want to clear your name. She knew exactly how much you suffered because of her family. She knew they treated you like dirt. She knew they made you clip coupons and struggle to pay basic utility bills while they flaunted millions of dollars in dirty money. Clara did not just leave you the satisfaction of revenge. She left you a completely new future." I looked up at Agent Miller, completely confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. Agent Miller opened the thick white folder. She pulled out a stack of highly classified federal financial documents. "When Clara first approached the Bureau 18 months ago, she did not just hand over the evidence for free," Agent Miller explained. "Your wife was an absolute master of financial law. She knew that the evidence she possessed was going to lead to the complete seizure of Bradley's entire real estate portfolio. She knew we were going to confiscate tens of millions of dollars in laundered cash. So Clara invoked the federal whistleblower protection and reward statutes." I sat perfectly still, trying to process the words. Whistleblower reward. I had heard the term before in my archiving work, but I never connected it to my own reality. Under federal law, Agent Miller continued tapping her pen on the documents when an informant provides actionable evidence that leads to the successful recovery of illicit funds. The government is legally obligated to pay that informant a percentage of the total recovered assets. It is designed to incentivize insiders to bring down massive financial syndicates. Clara's meticulous records, her downloaded server files, and her brilliant trap in that boardroom allowed the Department of Justice to seize exactly $40 million in liquid laundered assets. $40 million! I repeated the number, sounding completely fake in my mouth. "Yes," Agent Miller said, her smile growing wider. $40 million completely removed from the hands of violent criminals, thanks entirely to your wife. But Clara knew that her position was incredibly dangerous. She knew she might not survive to see the end of the operation. So she had our legal department structure her informant agreement with a highly specific beneficiary clause. She designated you, Thomas, as the sole exclusive heir to her federal whistleblower reward. The air in the sterile conference room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I gripped the edges of the metal table, my knuckles turning white. "You are telling me the federal government owes me money?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am telling you the federal government is legally mandated to pay you your wife's percentage of the $40 million seizure," Agent Miller corrected smoothly, and Clara made absolutely sure the paperwork was ironclad. "But that is not all she left you." Agent Miller reached back into the white folder and produced a second separate stack of papers. She slid them across the table, stopping them right in front of my hands. While Clara was pretending to be Bradley's ghost accountant, she was also quietly protecting your personal assets, Agent Miller explained. She knew that if the government seized the accounts, your joint finances would be temporarily frozen during the investigation. She wanted to make sure you had an immediate safety net that the banks could never touch. 4 years ago, she took out a massive private life insurance policy on herself. She did not pay the premiums from the joint checking account because she knew Bradley monitored her expenses. She paid the premiums entirely in cash using money she legally earned from her legitimate salary. The policy is completely clean, Thomas. It is absolutely untainted by the criminal enterprise. I stared down at the insurance documents. My name was typed clearly on the beneficiary line. The sheer, overwhelming weight of Clara's love pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. She had thought of absolutely everything. While I was sitting on the couch watching television, she was awake at midnight calculating the exact legal maneuvers required to build an impenetrable fortress around my future. She loved me with a fierce, unmatched devotion that I was only just beginning to truly understand. Agent Miller reached into her suit jacket pocket. She pulled out a long, crisp, rectangular piece of paper. It was a certified federal check printed by the United States Treasury. She placed it gently on top of the insurance documents and pushed the entire stack directly into my hands. The whistleblower percentage combined with the clean life insurance payout comes to a rather significant total, Agent Miller said quietly, respectfully, giving me the moment to process it. Clara wanted you to never have to worry about a single mortgage payment or utility bill for the rest of your natural life. She wanted you to have the freedom to live exactly the way you always deserved to live. I looked down at the certified federal check. My eyes scanned the numbers printed boldly across the center of the paper. $4,500,000. I completely broke down. I buried my face in my hands and sobbed openly in the federal conference room. The tears flowed hot and fast, completely unstoppable. I cried for the beautiful, brilliant woman who had died far too soon. I cried for the excruciating terror of sleeping in a freezing car, believing my life was entirely over. I cried for the incredible, profound relief of knowing that the people who treated me like disposable garbage were currently trading their custom suits for orange prison jumpsuits. Agent Miller did not rush me. She sat quietly across the table, allowing me to release the agonizing pressure that had been building inside my soul since the morning of the funeral. When I finally wiped my face and looked back up at her, my vision was blurry, but my heart was lighter than it had been in years. Thomas, Agent Miller said softly, leaning forward. You walked into that boardroom and faced down two incredibly dangerous people. You played your part perfectly. You honored your wife's sacrifice, and you delivered her justice. Now it is time for you to take her final gift and go live your life. Do not let her sacrifice be in vain. I picked up the federal check. The paper felt heavy and substantial. It did not feel like dirty money. It felt like love. It felt like absolute, pure, undeniable vindication. I stood up from the metal table. I reached out and shook Agent Miller's hand, grasping it firmly. Thank you, I said, my voice steady and clear. Thank you for helping her. Thank you for protecting me. It was the honor of my career, Agent Miller replied. I turned and walked out of the federal conference room, holding the white folder tightly against my chest. I walked down the long, bright hallways, taking the elevator down to the main lobby. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Just a few short weeks ago, I had stood in the pouring rain at a cemetery holding a manila envelope that was supposed to completely destroy my life. I was a man with a broken car, a padlocked house, and an empty bank account. I was the pathetic municipal archivist that everyone laughed at. Bradley and Susan had tried to completely erase me from the world just so they could keep their stolen luxury. Now they were locked in small concrete boxes waiting to spend the next 2 decades of their lives staring at gray walls. Their luxury yachts were gone. Their penthouse offices were seized. Their entire legacy was reduced to a stack of federal indictments. And I was walking down the busy city street with $4.5 million in my hand. I walked toward my beat-up Honda Civic, smiling for the first time since I lost my wife. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, placing the check carefully on the passenger side. I put the keys in the ignition and started the engine. I was going back to my quiet suburban house. I was going to pay off the mortgage entirely. I was going to sit in the living room and honor the incredible woman who loved me enough to conquer an empire. The drive back to my modest suburban neighborhood felt entirely different than it had just a few weeks prior. The heavy, crushing weight of absolute despair was completely gone from my chest. I pulled my beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic into the driveway and stared at the front door. The neon orange bank foreclosure sticker was still plastered against the glass pane. I walked up the concrete steps and peeled the sticker off with my bare hands, tearing the thick paper into tiny shreds and tossing them into the trash bin. I pulled the shiny new brass keys from my pocket. The federal mandate had forced the commercial bank to immediately remove the heavy steel padlock and issue me full unrestricted access to my own property. I slid the key into the deadbolt and turned it. The sharp metallic click was the greatest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I pushed the door open and stepped over the threshold. The house was incredibly quiet and smelled faintly of stale dust from being sealed up, but it was my sanctuary. I walked into the kitchen and ran my hands over the worn laminate countertops. I walked down the short hallway to my home office and looked at the shattered window I had broken during my frantic escape. The jagged glass was still scattered across the hardwood floor right next to the dried drops of my own blood. I grabbed a broom and swept up the debris, carefully discarding the physical remnants of my darkest night. The very next morning, I put on my best suit and drove directly to the main downtown branch of the commercial lending bank. It was the exact same bank that had frozen my accounts and tried to leave me completely homeless on the streets. The branch manager, who had previously refused to return any of my desperate phone calls, was suddenly waiting for me in the main lobby, sweating nervously. He ushered me into his private, plush office, offering me bottled water and endless, insincere apologies for the massive legal misunderstanding. I did not smile at him. I sat down in the expensive leather chair across from his desk and pulled the certified federal check from my inside jacket pocket. I placed the $4.5 million check directly on his polished wooden desk. I told him I wanted to pay off the primary mortgage of my house completely in cash right this very second. I watched his hands shake violently as he processed the massive transaction. He printed the final legal documents, stamping them with a heavy seal that declared the property free and clear of all financial debts. When I walked out of those heavy glass bank doors holding the physical paper deed to my home, I felt a level of profound, absolute security that Bradley and Susan had never truly known in their entire pathetic lives. Their wealth was built entirely on a crumbling foundation of lies and theft. But my home was bought and paid for with the absolute truth. Having millions of dollars sitting safely in a clean, high-yield account did not change the core of who I was. I did not immediately drive to a luxury car dealership and purchase a blacked-out sport utility vehicle to show off to the neighbors. I did not go out and buy custom-tailored suits or solid gold watches. I kept my 10-year-old Honda Civic because it served as a permanent daily reminder of the freezing night I slept in the grocery store parking lot. It reminded me of the exact moment I decided to stop running and start fighting back against the monsters in my life. I wanted to honor Clara by ensuring that the massive fortune she sacrificed her life to secure was used to build people up instead of tearing them down. I hired a team of elite educational attorneys to establish a massive financial endowment at the local state university. We created the Clara Memorial Scholarship Fund specifically designed to provide full tuition coverage for young women studying forensic accounting and criminal justice. I wanted to make absolutely certain that her name would never be associated with the fraudulent money laundering crimes of her corrupt mother and brother. I wanted her legacy to stand as a permanent shining beacon of courage and relentless justice. Every single year, 5 bright young women receive a completely free education because of the incredible sacrifice my wife made in the dark. It is the ultimate poetic revenge against Bradley. He tried to force Clara to be his invisible phantom ghost, forever trapped in the shadows of his arrogant criminal empire. But now her name is proudly carved into a massive bronze plaque at the university library, while his name is completely and utterly erased from civilized society. Exactly 6 months after the explosive federal raid in the penthouse boardroom, I received a secure phone call from Agent Miller. She personally invited me to attend the final sentencing hearing at the federal courthouse. I drove downtown and walked through the heavy security checkpoints, taking a seat in the very back row of the massive wooden gallery. I wore a simple, clean suit and sat perfectly still. The heavy oak doors at the front of the courtroom swung open, and the armed federal marshals led Bradley and Susan into the room. The physical and psychological transformation was absolutely shocking to witness firsthand. Bradley had lost at least 40 pounds of muscle. His expensive, stylish haircut was completely gone, replaced by a rough, uneven prison shave. He shuffled his feet as he walked, heavily restricted by the thick steel chains wrapping around his waist and ankles. He looked incredibly small, weak and terrified. Susan looked even worse. The confident, arrogant woman who had openly mocked me at my wife's grave, calling me a useless parasite, was now hunched over, completely broken. Her designer black mourning dresses were permanently replaced by a faded orange prison jumpsuit. She wept quietly into her shackled hands, unable to even look up at the judge. They had lost absolutely everything they ever valued. The federal prosecutors had systematically dismantled their entire real estate empire piece by piece. The government seized all the hidden offshore banking accounts, the downtown commercial properties, the luxury vehicles, and the massive private estates. They were left with nothing but their overwhelming, crushing guilt. The federal judge looked down at them from the high bench with absolute sheer disgust. He did not mince his words. He called them predatory financial parasites who had deliberately weaponized their own innocent family members out of pure, unadulterated greed. He sentenced Bradley to 25 years in a maximum security federal prison without any possibility of early parole. He sentenced Susan to 15 years. As the armed marshals dragged them out of the courtroom, Bradley slowly turned his head and looked at me one final time. He did not yell. He did not curse. He just stared at me with hollow, empty eyes, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his own catastrophic arrogance. He realized that in his desperate, greedy attempt to steal a modest house from a simple archivist, he had completely destroyed his own life. I walked out of the massive federal courthouse and took a long, slow walk through the city park. The leaves on the massive oak trees were changing colors, signaling the arrival of a crisp, beautiful autumn season. I sat on a wooden bench and watched ordinary people walking their dogs and drinking coffee. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air and reflected deeply on the fundamental nature of human greed. Bradley and Susan truly believed that power was defined solely by the illusion of massive wealth. They thought that wearing designer clothes and driving expensive luxury cars made them completely untouchable gods among regular men. They measured a person's absolute worth by the size of their bank account and the brand of their shoes. Because I was a municipal archivist making a very modest salary, they looked right through me. They automatically assumed I was a weak, pathetic loser who would simply roll over and surrender the moment I was aggressively challenged. They could not even begin to comprehend the concept of quiet, enduring strength. They completely dug their own massive graves because they could not resist the overwhelming urge to take absolutely everything from a man they thought was nothing. They wanted to strip the very roof from over my head simply because they enjoyed the cruel, vicious sport of crushing someone beneath their designer shoes. But real power does not live in a towering corporate boardroom. Real power does not require screaming insults over an open grave in the pouring rain. Real power is the immense patience to sit in the dark and wait for your arrogant enemy to make a fatal mistake. Real power is the profound, unconditional love that drives a quiet, gentle accountant to slowly take down an entire criminal syndicate just to protect her husband. I eventually went back to my job as a municipal archivist. The human resources director who had aggressively fired me was forced to issue a formal public apology after the federal government completely cleared my name in the press. I accepted her apology calmly, but I did not return to the city annex building because I needed the paycheck. I returned because I genuinely love my work. I love preserving the factual history of my city. I love the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the old archives. I continue to live in my modest 3-bedroom house in the quiet suburbs. I still drink cheap black coffee in the early morning, and I still paint my own baseboards when they get scuffed. The only major difference is that now I have an absolute impenetrable fortress of financial security, protecting me from the unpredictable cruelty of the outside world. Every single evening when I come home from work, I look at the framed wedding photo of Clara sitting proudly on my desk. I replaced the broken glass window. I completely cleaned the dried blood off the hardwood floor. I took the small, worn leather journal filled with our simple love notes and placed it carefully on the nightstand right next to my bed. I read one note every single night before I go to sleep. It reminds me that I was fiercely loved by a true absolute hero. It reminds me that I survived the darkest storm imaginable because a brave, brilliant woman decided to fight back against the monsters in her own family. I am not a loser. I am not a parasite. I am a survivor who holds the ultimate quiet victory. Sometimes the people who push you to the edge of the cliff do not realize they are the ones about to fall. If you have ever had a loved one sacrifice for you, or if you have ever proven arrogant people wrong, hit the like button and share this story. Leave a comment below about a time you found strength you did not know you had. And subscribe for more stories about justice secrets and the unexpected ways life balances the scales.